The wind up in the high San Juans did not just blow, it hunted. It sought out the cracks in the chinking of the cabin walls, the gaps in a man's coat, and the hollow places in his chest where the heat used to be. Eli Mercer stood in the center of his uncle's cabin, his breath pluming white in the stagnant, freezing air. He had the deed and the will folded inside his coat pocket, pressing against his ribs like a slab of cold iron. The place was half frozen and smelled of old grease, pine pitch, and a loneliness so heavy it felt like a physical weight on his shoulders. A cast-iron skillet sat on the stove, congealed bacon fat turning white in the bottom. A half-whittled trap trigger lay on the rough-hewn table, the knife resting beside it, the shavings curled and dry. It looked as if his uncle, Silas, had stood up to check a noise outside or relieve himself at the tree line and simply stepped off the edge of the world. Eli ran a gloved hand over the back of the single chair. He was 32 years old, with hands scarred from beaver traps and a face weathered by 10 years of high country sun and wind. He had not seen Silas in 4 years, and now the man was a frozen mound of earth in the settlement cemetery down in the valley, and Eli was the owner of a cabin that felt more like a tomb than a home. He walked to the window, scraping a circle in the frost on the glass. The country out there was harsh, beautiful, and indifferent to whether a man lived or died. The timber grew thick and steep, black spikes against the white slopes. Wolf tracks printed the snow near the woodpile, bold and fresh. Down below, the river was a ribbon of black ice, but Eli knew that in the spring melt, it would turn into a roaring throat capable of swallowing a horse and rider whole. "This inheritance is simple," he told himself. The words sounded hollow in the silence. Trap, trade, survive. He did not need people. He did not need the complications of a town. He just needed the solitude that Silas had cherished. The quiet that let a man think without the noise of civilization cluttering his head. But to survive the winter, he needed supplies that Silas had evidently run out of. The flour bin was scraping bottom, and the coffee tin was empty. The ride down to the settlement took the better part of the morning. The horse, a roan mare with a temper as short as the days, picked her way carefully over the icy trail. When Eli reached the cluster of buildings that dared to call itself a town, the mood on the street was tight. Men watched him from the boardwalks, their eyes shifting away when he met their gaze. He tied the mare in front of the general store and went inside. The warmth of the potbelly stove hit him, smelling of wet wool and tobacco. The storekeep, a man named Henderson with a bald head and nervous hands, nodded at him. "You must be Eli," Henderson said. "Silas told us he had a nephew up north." Eli nodded, moving to the counter. "I am him. I need 50 pounds of flour, 10 pounds of beans, coffee, and salt pork, and a box of 44 cartridges." Henderson began gathering the items, his movements jerky. "A shame about your uncle. A real shame. It is a hard way to go, falling in a ravine like that." Eli leaned against the counter. "That is what the sheriff said." "Accidental?" Henderson paused, his hand hovering over the coffee tin. "Well, that is what the official paper says. Sheriff Halloway is a thorough man." The way Henderson said it made the hair on the back of Eli's neck stand up. It was the tone of a man repeating a line he had been told to memorize. Eli narrowed his eyes. "You have something to say. Henderson, say it." Henderson looked toward the door, then lowered his voice. "I am just saying Silas knew these mountains better than any man alive. He could walk a ridge blindfolded in a blizzard. For him to slip." The bell above the door jingled. Henderson snapped his mouth shut and busied himself with the weighing scale. 2 men walked in, wearing long dusters despite the snow outside. They were not locals. They had the clean-shaven, hard-eyed look of hired guns, the kind that usually rode for cattle barons or mining syndicates. They looked Eli up and down, dismissing him as nothing more than a ragged mountain drifter, then moved to the back of the store. Eli paid for his goods with coin, the silver clinking out in the quiet room. As he hauled the sacks over his shoulder, Henderson leaned in one last time. "Watch yourself up there, Mercer. There is a new land agent in town, fellow named Sterling. He has been measuring the valley. asking about timber rights, and the sheriff. Well, he smiles too much these days. Eli grunted his thanks and walked out. The air outside tasted of snow. The blue sky of the morning was turning the color of an iron skillet, heavy and gray. The wind had picked up, biting like teeth against his exposed skin. He lashed the supplies to the pack saddle and mounted the roan. He had to push hard. If the pass closed before he got back to the cabin, he would be sleeping in a drift, and he might end up just like Silas. The ride back was a battle. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in an hour. The wind screamed through the pines, whipping snow into blinding sheets. By the time the cabin came into view, dusk was settling like a bruise over the valley. Eli got the horse into the lean-to barn, rubbing her down quickly and tossing her an extra flake of hay. He grabbed the saddlebags and the rifle, trudging through the knee-deep drifts toward the cabin door. He saw the tracks first. They were small, too small for a man. They dragged, as if whoever made them could barely lift their feet. They led right up to the porch steps. Eli dropped his hand to the colt on his hip. He pushed the door open, the hinges groaning. Inside, the stove was dark. The room was freezing. But standing in the center of the room, shivering so violently her teeth chattered in a rhythm he could hear from the doorway, was a woman. She looked like something the storm had chewed up and spat out. Her coat was thin wool, wholly unsuited for the high country. Her boots were split at the seams, wet snow packed into the leather. Her face was raw, windburned to a violent red, and her lips were blue. She clutched a small, battered valise in one hand and a piece of paper in the other. Eli kicked the door shut behind him, cutting off the wind. "Who are you?" he barked, his voice rough with the cold and the shock of finding a stranger in his dead uncle's sanctuary. The woman turned to face him. She stood straight, but he could see it was only stubbornness holding her up. She looked ready to collapse. She held out the paper with a trembling hand. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She swallowed, forced air into her lungs, and tried again. Her voice was a rasp, brittle as dry leaves. "I was promised to him," she said. Eli stared at her, the snow melting on his shoulders and dripping onto the floorboards. "What?" She took a step forward, swaying. "The letter. It is from Silas Mercer. He sent for me." Eli did not take the paper. "Silas is dead." The woman flinched as if he had struck her. Her eyes, dark and hollowed by exhaustion, widened. "Dead? Buried last week," Eli said, stripping off his heavy gloves. "So whatever business you had with him is finished. You cannot stay here." The woman looked around the cold, dark cabin, then back at Eli. The desperation in her face hardened into something terrified but resolute. She lifted her chin. "I have nowhere to go," she whispered. "That is not my problem," Eli said. He was tired, he was cold, and he wanted to be alone. He walked past her to the stove, reaching for the kindling. "You can warm up, but then you are going back down the mountain." "I cannot go back." The sharpness in her voice made him pause. He turned to look at her again. She was gripping the valise so hard her knuckles were white. "I traveled 2,000 miles, she said, her voice gaining a fraction of strength. "I spent every cent I had. I walked the last 10 miles in this storm because the stage driver refused to take the pass." Eli struck a match and lit the kindling. The fire caught with a roar, casting dancing yellow light over her face. He saw the lines of fatigue, the hunger, the fear she was trying to hide behind that stiff spine. She held out the paper again. "Read it, please." Eli snatched the letter from her hand. It was crumpled and stained with water. He recognized Silas's scrawl immediately. "Dear Clara, the cabin is sturdy and the valley is quiet. I need a wife to help with the curing and the garden, and you need a place where the past cannot find you. I am an old man, and I cannot offer you passion, but I can offer you safety and my name. If you come, I promise you will never go hungry and you will never be struck again. Yours." Silas Mercer. Eli lowered the letter. He looked at the woman, Clara. He looked at the line about being struck. He looked at the way she held herself, like a dog that expects a kick. "He offered you marriage," Eli said slowly. "Yes." Clara said, "Well, he is gone, and I'm not looking for a wife. I'm not asking for marriage," she said quickly. "I'm asking for shelter. I can work. I can cook. I can mend." "No," Eli said. He tossed the letter onto the table. "I live alone. I work alone." Clara took a breath. She looked at the door, where the wind was battering the wood with the sound of 1,000 angry fists. Then she looked back at Eli, and she said the words that knocked the air right out of the room. "I was promised to him," she said, her voice steady now, terrifyingly calm. "Now I am yours." Eli recoiled. The words hung in the air, ugly and heavy. Obligation, ownership, the kind of twisted bargain that turned people into property. "I am not taking his leavings," Eli snarled, his defensive instinct turning cruel. "And I am not taking his problems. You think because you have a piece of paper you can just trade yourself to the next man in line?" Clara's face went white, the burn on her cheek standing out like paint. "It is not like that." "It sounds exactly like that," Eli shot back. "I cannot go back," she screamed, the sudden volume cracking in the small room. "If I go back down that mountain tonight, I will die. The cold will kill me before I make the first ridge. Is that what you want? You want to drag a frozen woman off your porch in the morning?" Eli stared at her. The fire popped, a loud crack in the tension. Outside, the storm howled, a low, mournful sound that spoke of deep snow and killing frost. He knew she was right. Sending her out there now was a death sentence. The wolves he had seen earlier would have her before the frostbite did. He cursed under his breath, a long stream of profanity that he didn't care if she heard. He kicked a log into place in the stove and slammed the iron door shut. "One night," he said, his voice hard. "You stay one night. The storm breaks. You go." Clara let out a breath that was half sob. She nodded. "Thank you." "Do not thank me," Eli snapped. "And do not get comfortable." He pointed to the far corner of the room. "You sleep there. Keep your clothes on." Clara nodded again. She set her valise down. Her hands were shaking so bad she couldn't undo the buttons of her coat. Eli watched her struggle for a moment, the pathetic sight of her frozen fingers fumbling with the wool. With a growl of annoyance, he stepped forward and batted her hands away. "Let me do it." She flinched violently when his hands came near her throat, her head jerking back, eyes squeezing shut. Eli froze. His hands hovered in the air. He saw the terror in the way she braced herself, the way her breath hitched and held. It was the reaction of an animal that had learned that touch meant pain. He slowly lowered his hands. "Undo it yourself, then," he said quietly. He turned his back on her and went to unpack the supplies. He heard the soft rustle of wet wool falling to the floor, the sound of her moving toward the stove. They set the rules in silence. Separate bedrolls. He took the bunk built into the wall. She took the pallet of furs near the hearth. No questions. No chatter. Clara sat on the furs, her knees pulled to her chest. The heat from the stove began to thaw her out, and he could see the pain of it on her face. The way the blood rushing back into frozen limbs felt like needles. She didn't complain. She just sat there, staring into the fire, her eyes glassy. Eli sat at the table, cleaning his rifle. The metallic click-clack of the lever action was the only conversation. He watched her from the corner of his eye. She was younger than he had thought at first, maybe 25, but her eyes were old. The wind clawed at the chinks in the logs. Snow hissed against the hot stovepipe. "I am not a whore," she said suddenly into the silence. Eli didn't look up from the gun. "I didn't say you were. You thought it. I thought you were a woman who traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man she never met. That makes you desperate, or foolish, maybe both," Clara said softly. "But back east, back there, I was dead already. At least here. I have a chance." Eli looked at her then. The firelight caught the curve of her cheek, the stubborn set of her jaw. "You call this a chance? Freezing to death in a stranger's cabin?" She met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw the steel in her. "I am warm right now. Mr. Mercer. That is more than I was yesterday." He didn't have an answer for that. He blew out the lantern and climbed into his bunk. the darkness swallowing the room. The night was a study in small sounds, the stove popping as the wood shifted, the wind rattling the door latch, and from the floor, the sound of Clara's breathing. It was ragged, hitching every few minutes. He could hear her turning, trying to find comfort on the hard floor. He could hear the soft scuff of fabric as she pulled her coat tighter around her. She slept in her clothes, boots and all, ready to run. Eli lay awake for a long time, his hand resting near the revolver on the shelf. He was used to the silence of the mountains. He wasn't used to the sound of another human being breathing in his space. It felt like an intrusion. It felt like danger. Morning broke with a silence that was deafening. The storm had passed, leaving the world buried under 2 feet of fresh powder. The light coming through the window was blindingly white. Eli swung his legs out of the bunk. Clara was already up. She had the stove going and was melting snow in the big copper kettle. She looked exhausted, dark circles bruised under her eyes, but she was moving. "There is no water," she said, her voice raspy. "The bucket is cracked." "I know," Eli said. "I have been meaning to fix it. I used the snow," she said. "I found some coffee beans in the bottom of a sack. It is weak, but it is hot." She held out a tin cup. Eli took it. He took a sip. It was practically hot water, but she had tried. "We are low on everything," Eli said. "I brought flour and beans yesterday, but with 2 of us, it will not last as long." He caught himself. With 2 of us. He had already included her in the math. "You are leaving today," he said, correcting himself. "As soon as the sun softens the crust on the snow." Clara didn't argue. She just turned back to the stove. "I will make biscuits before I go. You need to eat." She worked the dough with efficient, practiced hands. She wasn't delicate. She didn't fuss. She found the salt pork, sliced it thin, and got it frying. The smell of grease and bread filled the cabin, pushing back the smell of old smoke. After they ate, a silent meal. Standing up, Eli went out to chop wood. The drift against the door was waist-high. He shoveled a path, his breath smoking. Clara came out a moment later, wrapped in her coat. She watched him split a log with a single, clean swing of the axe. "Show me," she said. Eli rested the axe head in the snow. "Why?" "Because if I am walking down that mountain, I might need to make a fire, and I do not want to cut my own foot off." Eli looked at her. The snow was deep. The pass would be treacherous. And looking at her broken boots, he knew she wouldn't make it 5 miles. He sighed, a long exhale of defeat. "Come here." He showed her how to hold the axe handle, where to place her feet so a glancing blow would go into the ground and not her shin. He showed her how to read the grain of the wood. She was weak, but she listened. She choked up on the handle, swung, and the wood splintered. Not a clean split, but it opened. Again. Eli said. She swung again, better this time. She worked until she was panting, her cheeks flushed. She wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her glove. "You are not useless," Eli muttered. "Is that a compliment?" Clara asked, leaning on the axe. "It is a fact," Eli said. He looked up at the sky. The clouds were gathering again over the peaks. Another front moving in. The winter wasn't waiting. "If you leave now," he said, looking at the peaks, "you will get caught in the next squall." Clara followed his gaze. She didn't say anything. She waited. Eli spat into the snow. "You stay until the pass is clear. 2 days, maybe 3, but you work for your keep. I am not running a hotel." Clara let out a breath, her shoulders sagging in relief. "I will work. I promise." They made a plan. They needed more meat. The salt pork wouldn't last. Eli had to check the trap line Silas had set. "I am going to check the traps," Eli said. "You stay here, patch that bucket, and see if you can find where Silas hid the rest of the ammunition. He never kept it all in one place." "I will find it," Clara said. Eli strapped on his snowshoes and headed out. He felt her watching him until he disappeared into the timber. The next few days fell into a rhythm. Eli checked traps. Beaver, marten, the occasional fox. Clara stayed at the cabin. She cleaned. She scrubbed the floors until the wood was pale. She found the hidden ammunition box under a loose floorboard. She mended Eli's torn spare coat, but the tension was always there. If Eli moved too fast, she froze. If he raised his voice to curse a stubborn knot in a rope, she made herself small. On the third day, the weather held. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue. "We need to go to town," Eli said at breakfast. Clara looked up from her plate. "Both of us. I cannot leave you here alone, not with the wolves moving closer. And if we are going to winter this out," he paused, "if you are staying, we need more than 50 pounds of flour." Clara nodded slowly. She understood. He was accepting it. She wasn't going anywhere. They rode double on the mare, Clara sitting behind the saddle, holding onto Eli's coat. The contact was awkward. She tried to hold on without touching him too much, her hands hovering, gripping the fabric but not the man. Halfway down the valley, Eli pulled the mare up short. "What is it?" Clara whispered. Eli nodded toward a ridgeline about a mile away. The sun glinted off something metal. A flash. "Someone is watching," Eli said. "Spyglass. Who?" "I do not know, but honest men do not hide on ridges watching other men's houses." He spurred the horse on, keeping to the tree line where the shadows were deep. The town was busy when they arrived. The arrival of a woman, any woman, let alone a stranger, was an event. As they rode down the main street, heads turned. Women in bonnets stopped sweeping their porches to stare, their eyes cold and assessing. Men paused in their work, leaning on shovels, their gazes lingering on Clara's legs where her skirt hiked up slightly on the horse. Eli felt the heat of it. He felt Clara shrink against his back. He pulled up in front of the general store. "Stay close to me," he murmured. When they walked in, conversation died. Henderson looked up, his eyes widening. "Well," Henderson said, breaking the silence, "I see you found company." Eli ignored him. "I need another 100 pounds of flour. Sugar, dried apples if you have them." "And wool." "Wool?" Henderson asked, looking at Clara. "For a dress," Eli said. "And boots. Size small." Henderson smirked, a small smile that suggested he knew exactly what kind of arrangement this was. He turned to Clara. "You are the girl Silas mentioned? The one he sent for?" Clara lifted her chin. "I am Clara." Henderson chuckled. "Right. Clara. Well, miss, you certainly traded up." Silas was old. "But Mercer here? He is in his prime, I suppose." The implication hung in the air like a foul smell, that she was property, that she had simply been passed down along with the cabin and the traps. Eli's jaw tightened. Just get the goods. Henderson. While Henderson busied himself, a woman in a gray dress walked by the aisle. She pulled her skirts aside as she passed Clara, as if avoiding a puddle of filth. "Shameless," the woman whispered, loud enough for the whole room to hear. Clara went rigid. She stared straight ahead, her face burning. Eli took a step toward the woman, his hands curling into fists. But Clara caught his sleeve. Her grip was tight. "Do not," she whispered. "Please." Eli stopped. He looked at the faces in the store. Judgment, amusement, disgust. They saw a mountain man and his kept woman. They saw a scandal. He paid Henderson, slamming the coins down on the counter hard enough to make the man jump. As they were loading the pack horse, a man approached them. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than Eli's cabin. He wore a bowler hat and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Mercer?" the man said. Eli tied the knot on the flour sack. "Who is asking?" The man tipped his hat. "Archibald Sterling, land agent. I believe we have mutual interests. I have no interests that involve you," Eli said. Sterling chuckled smoothly. "Direct. I like that. Look, Mercer, your uncle's claim. It is a bit messy. The boundaries are disputed. The timber rights are unclear. I represent a consortium that is looking to develop this valley. We are willing to offer you a very generous price for the cabin and the land, buy you out, save you the legal trouble." "I am not selling," Eli said. Sterling's smile thinned into a wire. "It is a harsh country, Mr. Mercer. Accidents happen, like with your uncle. It would be a shame if you got bogged down in court battles or other Difficulties. Eli stepped close to Sterling. He smelled of bay rum and corruption. "If you set foot on my land," Eli said, his voice low and dangerous, "I will bury you on it." Sterling didn't flinch, but his eyes went cold. "Think about it, Mercer. You have a dependent to care for now. It costs money to keep a woman happy." Eli mounted the horse, pulling Clara up behind him. He didn't look back as he rode out of town. The ride back was silent. The sun was setting, casting long purple shadows across the snow. The encounter in town had shifted something. The outside world had touched them, stained them. Clara spoke only once. "They think I am a whore," she said. Eli didn't answer immediately. "They think what they want. It does not make it true. But they said Silas was cheated." She said, "That woman." She whispered that Silas was mixed up in something, that he was robbed. "People talk." Eli said he was scared. Clara said, in his letters, he sounded scared. He said he needed a wife for safety. Maybe he didn't mean his safety. Maybe he meant he needed a witness. Eli frowned. That thought had not occurred to him. When they got back to the cabin, it was fully dark. They unpacked in silence. The atmosphere was thick, charged with the insults of the town and the threat of the land agent. "I need to wash," Clara said. "I feel dirty." Eli nodded. He hung a heavy wool blanket from the rafters, partitioning off the corner near the stove where the washtub sat. He sat at the table, forcing himself to focus on the ledger book Silas had left, trying to decipher the scrawled entries. Behind the blanket, he heard the water splash into the tub. He heard the rustle of clothes, the soft sigh of Clara stepping into the hot water. The sounds were intimate, violently so. The cabin was small. The air grew damp and warm. He could smell the soap, a rough lye soap, but on her skin, it would smell sweet. Eli stared at the page, but the numbers blurred. He was acutely aware of her nakedness just 5 feet away. He was aware of his own solitude, which had been broken. He heard the water slosh as she moved. He imagined the heat on her skin. He imagined the bruises he knew were there, the scars she carried from whatever life she had fled. Desire, slow and heavy, uncoiled in his gut. It angered him. He didn't want her. She was a burden. She was trouble. She was promised to a dead man. The splashing stopped. A few minutes later, Clara stepped out from behind the blanket. She was wearing a clean shift and a heavy skirt. Her hair wet and dark, clinging to her neck. Her face was scrubbed clean, pale and vulnerable. She saw him watching her. She didn't look away this time. She walked to the stove to dry her hair. The silence stretched, tight as a bowstring. "Why did you not take the money?" she asked softly. "From the agent." "Because it is my land," Eli said. "Is it? Or are you just stubborn?" "Maybe both." She turned to face him. The firelight was behind her, outlining her shape through the thin fabric of her shift. "You could have sold it. You could have left me in town with enough money to go somewhere else. You could have been free of this." "I do not run from men like Sterling," Eli said. "And me?" Clara asked. Her voice dropped, barely a whisper. "Do you run from me?" Eli stood up. The chair scraped loud on the floor. Clara took a step toward him. "In town, when that man called me your girl, you got angry. I do not like insults." "Was it an insult?" she asked. "To be mine?" Eli looked at her. He looked at the pulse beating in her throat. He wanted to cross the space between them. He wanted to touch her, just once, to see if she was as soft as she looked. But he saw the fear still lurking in her eyes, the way her hands were balled into fists at her sides. She was testing him, or maybe she was asking for the only thing she knew how to trade. "You are safe here." "Clara," Eli said, his voice rough. "That is all this is? Safety?" Clara searched his face. Her eyes were wide. "Dark pools. Is it?" she asked. "Or are you just terrified that you might actually want me?" Eli opened his mouth to answer, to deny it, to tell her she was crazy. But the words died in his throat, because looking at her, with the smell of soap and wood smoke in the air. He knew he couldn't answer without lying. "Go to sleep," Eli said, turning away abruptly. He walked to the door and stepped out into the cold, needing the bite of the winter wind to cool the heat in his blood. Behind him, he heard Clara let out a long, shaky breath, but he did not turn back. Winter clamped down on the San Juans like a heavy iron lid. The sky turned a permanent, bruised purple-gray, and the silence of the high country grew so profound it felt as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. The cabin became their entire universe, a small wooden island in a sea of white that stretched endlessly in every direction. The world shrank down to the cast-iron stove, the rough-hewn table, the separate bedrolls, and the constant, grinding work of not dying. Eli Mercer moved through this frozen world with the economy of a man who knew that wasted motion burned heat, and heat was life. He watched Clara watch him. She was learning. The terror that had vibrated off her in those first few days had settled into a grim determination. She did not complain about the cold anymore, mostly because she realized the cold did not care. One morning, with the thermometer mercury surely buried at the bottom of the glass, Eli took her out to the woodpile. The air was so sharp, it felt like inhaling crushed glass. "Look here," Eli said, pointing to the snow around the chopping block. Clara squinted, her breath puffing out in white clouds. "I see tracks." "What kind?" She hesitated. "Rabbit?" Eli shook his head. "Snowshoe hare. See how the back feet land ahead of the front? That means he was moving fast. Something spooked him." He pointed toward the tree line. "And there!" Clara looked. She saw nothing but pine shadows. Then she gasped. A shape detached itself from the gloom. A coyote, watching them with yellow eyes. "It is watching the cabin," Clara whispered. "It is watching for scraps," Eli corrected. "Or mistakes. Out here, you are part of the food chain. Clara, never forget that. If you slip, if you freeze, if you get weak, something is waiting to take your place." He taught her the rhythms of survival with a patience that surprised him. He showed her how to check the traps before dawn, handling the frozen steel with wool mitts so her skin would not bond to the metal. He taught her how to render fat from the beaver carcasses to grease their boots and keep the water out. He showed her how to recognize the white, waxy patch of frostbite on a nose or cheek before it turned black, when he touched her face to show her where the wind burned. His fingers were calloused, but gentle. Clara stood very still during these lessons, her eyes tracking his face, searching for the anger she seemed to expect from any man. She never found it. Inside the cabin, Clara began to carve out her own domain. Eli came in one evening, stomping snow from his boots, to find her sitting at the table with Silas's old ledger book open. She had found a pencil stub and was sharpening it with a paring knife. "What are you doing?" Eli asked, hanging his coat on the peg. "Making sense of this mess," Clara said, not looking up. "Your uncle kept his accounts in his head. That is a bad way to do business." She turned the book around. Eli looked at the pages. Silas's scratching scrawl had been replaced by neat, precise columns. "We have 40 pounds of flour left," Clara said, tapping the paper. 12 pounds of beans. If we ration the coffee to 1 cup a day, it will last until March, and I have cataloged the pelts. You have 14 prime beaver, 6 marten, and 3 fox. At current prices, that is enough to buy supplies for next winter, provided the trader does not cheat you. Eli stared at her. He could read, but barely. Numbers had always been a slippery language to him. "You can do sums?" he asked. "My father was a merchant," Clara said. Her voice went flat. "Before the debts, I kept his books from the time I was 12. She looked at the mended tear in Eli's spare shirt, folded neatly on the bench. "I also fixed your woolens, and I organized the root cellar so the potatoes will not rot from the damp." Eli sat down heavily on the bench. He looked at the order she had created, the clean floor, the stacked wood, the ledger. It was a small order against a wild world, but it was there. "You earn your keep, Clara," he said quietly. Clara looked at him, and for the first time, a genuine smile touched her lips. It was small and fleeting, but it transformed her face. I told you I was not useless. But the peace inside the cabin was fragile, besieged by the world outside. The first real conflict did not come from the weather, but from the town. It started on a Tuesday, or what they reckoned was a Tuesday. Clara was restless. She paced the small floor, her skirts swishing against the wood. "I want to go with you on the next run to the settlement," she said. Eli was oiling his rifle. "No, why not? Because it is safer here." "Safer for whom?" Clara demanded, turning on him. "For me, or for your reputation?" Eli looked up. "It is not about reputation. It is about trouble. It is about shame," Clara snapped. "You are ashamed to be seen with me. You think if you keep me hidden up here, people will forget I exist. But they know. Eli, they already know. I am not ashamed." Eli lied. He was not ashamed of her, but he was terrified of what the town's judgment would do to her. He had seen how Henderson looked at her. He knew what men said in saloons. "I am not a prisoner," Clara said. "I want to walk into that store on my own feet. I want to look those people in the eye. If I am to live here, I will not live as a ghost." Before they could resolve it, the world came to them. A mule plodded up the snowy trail 2 days later, carrying a man wrapped in black wool. It was Reverend Pike, a circuit rider who traveled between the mining camps and the high settlements. He was a thin man with a face like a hatchet and eyes that seemed to count sins. Eli met him on the porch, rifle in the crook of his arm. "Reverend," Eli said, not stepping aside. "Brother Mercer," Pike said, his voice carrying the practiced resonance of the pulpit. "I heard of your uncle's passing. I came to offer prayer and to see if rumors were true." "What rumors?" "That you have taken in a boarder. A female boarder." Clara stepped out onto the porch then. She had braided her hair tight and put on her cleanest apron. She held her head high, though Eli saw her hands trembling in the folds of her skirt. "I am Clara," she said. "I was promised to Silas Mercer." Pike looked at her. He did not offer his hand. He looked at her neck, her waist, her boots. It was a look of inspection, devoid of charity. "Promised," Pike repeated. "A promise to a dead man holds no water in the eyes of the Lord. Miss, and a woman living under the roof of a bachelor, without the sanctity of vows, well, it invites the devil. We are surviving winter. Reverend," Eli said, his voice hard, "there is no devil here but the cold." Pike turned his gaze back to Eli. "The flesh is weak. Brother Mercer, the town speaks of little else. They say you are keeping a concubine in your uncle's house. They say it is an affront to decency." "Get off my land," Eli said. Pike stiffened. "I came to save your souls. You came to spy," Eli said. "Ride on, Reverend, before the snow gets deep." Pike turned his mule, his face pinching with righteous anger. "You cannot hide sin in the high country. Eli Mercer, it shines like blood on snow." He rode away, his back straight as a ramrod. Eli knew that by the time Pike reached the valley, the story would be twisted and magnified. He had carried their business downhill like a spark into dry grass. "We have to go to town," Clara said, watching the preacher disappear. Eli spat over the rail. "Why? To hear more of that? To stop it." She said, "If we hide, we prove them right." They rode down 3 days later. The tension between them was a physical thing, tighter than the cinch on the saddle. The town did not welcome them. It tolerated them, like a bad smell. Clara walked into the dry goods store, Eli trailing a step behind. She went to the counter where bolts of calico and wool were stacked. Mrs. Gable, the shopkeeper's wife, was measuring fabric for another woman. She looked up, saw Clara, and her face went rigid. "I would like 3 yards of the blue wool," Clara said, her voice steady. "Mrs." Gable turned her back. "We are out of stock." Clara pointed to the bolt on the shelf. "It is right there. Mrs." Gable did not turn around. "It is spoken for. All of it." The other woman in the store gathered her packages and scurried out, shooting a scandalized look at Clara. Clara stood there, the rejection stinging her cheeks redder than the wind had. "Come on," Eli said gently, reaching for her arm. She pulled away. "No." She walked to the counter. "Mrs. Gable." My money is silver, same as anyone else's. And your morals are counterfeit. Mrs., Gable hissed, finally turning, I will not have a kept woman handling my goods. It is indecent. Eli stepped forward, his boots heavy on the floorboards. The shop went silent. Mrs., Gable shrank back against the shelves. Be careful, Eli warned, his voice a low rumble. Clara stepped between them. No, Eli, she looked Mrs. Gable in the eye. I am a woman trying to survive. If that offends you, the sin is yours, not mine. She walked out, head high, but outside, on the boardwalk, she sagged against the wall, fighting tears. It did not end there. As they passed the saloon, a man lounging in the doorway, one of the hired hands Eli had seen before, spoke up. Hey, Mercer, he called out. You done with her yet? I got $5, says she cooks better than she warms a bed. The men around him laughed. Eli stopped. The world narrowed down to the man's grinning, tobacco-stained mouth. The rage that Eli usually kept chained in the basement of his soul broke loose. He dropped the supplies and took a step toward the man, his hand going to the knife at his belt. The man's grin faltered. He saw death coming at him in Eli's eyes. Eli, Clara said. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the red haze. Eli, stop! Eli froze. He was shaking. Every muscle in his body wanted to tear the man apart. He wanted to silence the laughter with blood. It was the old way, the way of the logging camps, the way of the man he used to be. He looked at Clara. She was pale, terrified not of the man, but of him, of what he was about to become. He forced his hand away from the knife. He forced his breath to steady. He picked up the supplies. You are not worth the jail time, Eli said to the man. He took Clara's arm and led her to the horses. He could feel her watching him, witnessing the restraint that cost him everything he had. They rode back in silence, the shame of the town clinging to them. But something had shifted. Clara had seen his violence, and she had seen him conquer it for her sake. A week later, the river nearly took her. They were checking the lower trap line. The weather had warmed slightly, a false spring that made the ice treacherous, rotten underneath while looking solid on top. Clara was walking near the bank, carrying the skinning knife. Stay back from the edge, Eli called out. The current is eating the ice from below. I'm careful, Clara said. She stepped toward a willow branch to steady herself. The ice did not crack. It sighed. Then it simply vanished beneath her. There was no scream, just a splash and the sudden absence of her. Clara! Eli roared. He dropped his rifle and scrambled down the bank. The water was black and churning. He saw her red scarf bobbing. Then her head broke the surface, gasping, eyes wide with shock. The current grabbed her, dragging her toward the darker water where the ice sheet resumed. If she went under the main sheet, she was dead. Eli didn't think. He vaulted into the water. The cold hit him like a sledgehammer, knocking the air from his lungs. It was an agony that stopped the heart. He thrashed forward, grabbing for her coat. His fingers brushed wool, slipped, then caught. He hauled backward, digging his boots into the river mud, fighting the weight of her sodden skirts and the pull of the river. He dragged her up onto the snowbank. She was coughing water, her lips already turning blue, her body convulsing with shivers. We have to get you dry, Eli gasped. Now! The cabin was 2 miles away. Too far. She would freeze before they got there. He looked around. There was a rock overhang nearby, sheltered from the wind, where they sometimes stored dry wood. He picked her up, ignoring the screaming protest of his own frozen muscles, and ran for the shelter. He dumped her onto the dry earth and immediately began ripping at the buttons of her coat. Clara stammered, her teeth clacking so hard she couldn't speak. We have to get these wet clothes off, Eli ordered. Do not fight me. He stripped the heavy, sodden wool coat, then the dress. The wet fabric clung to her skin like ice. He was ruthless with the buttons, popping several. She tried to help, her hands fumbling uselessly. When she was down to her shift, which was soaked through and transparent, she curled into a ball, shaking violently. It is not enough, Eli muttered. He stripped off his own coat, which was dry on the inside. He sat down against the rock wall and pulled her into him, wrapping the heavy buffalo coat around both of them. He pressed her back against his chest, wrapping his legs around hers, surrounding her with his body heat. "Stop shaking," he whispered into her wet hair. "I have got you." It was practical. It was necessary. It was the only way to keep her alive. But as the warmth began to return to her, the nature of the embrace changed. He could feel every curve of her back against his chest. He could feel the soft swell of her hips. He could smell the river water and the scent of her skin. The adrenaline of the rescue faded, replaced by a sudden, sharp awareness of her body pressed against his. Clara stopped shivering. She lay still in his arms, her breathing shallow. "Eli," she whispered. "Don't talk," he said, his voice rough. "Save your heat." But the charge in the air was undeniable. His hands were on her arms, rubbing friction into the skin, but the movement felt like a caress. Back at the cabin, an hour later, the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. They had ridden the horse back at a gallop. Inside, Eli built the fire up until the stove glowed cherry red. Clara stood by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, while her clothes steamed on the line. Eli was drying his own hair with a towel. He stepped toward her to hand her a cup of hot tea. As he reached out, he brushed her shoulder. Clara stiffened, her breath hitched, a sharp intake of air, and she flinched away, her eyes squeezing shut as if expecting a blow. Eli stopped dead. The cup rattled in the saucer. The boundary flashed into view like a lightning strike. It wasn't just modesty, it was memory. Eli slowly set the cup on the table. He backed away, giving her space. "I am not him," Eli said softly. Clara opened her eyes. She looked at him, shame warring with relief on her face. "I know," she whispered. "I know you are not, but the body remembers. Eli, even when the mind knows better." Eli nodded. He felt a sickness in his gut, thinking of whoever had taught her to flinch like that. "I will never touch you in anger. Clara, you have my word." The days that followed were quieter, but the air was thick with things unspoken. The outside world, however, refused to leave them be. Rumors drifted up with the wind. A trapper passing through told Eli that Sterling, the land agent, was filing papers in the county seat. He was claiming Silas's cabin sat on contested ground, an old survey error that put the land back in public domain, which meant it was up for sale to the mining consortium. The sheriff, Halloway, was backing him. Then came the stranger. He rode up on a fine bay gelding. His boots were polished, too clean for the mountains. He carried a leather satchel. Eli met him at the porch steps. Clara watched from the window. "Mr. Mercer?" the stranger asked. Eli nodded. "My name is Finch. I am looking for a Miss Clara Vance. She goes by Mercer now." Eli said, "Does she?" Finch smiled, a thin, knowing smile. "Is she properly married, Mr. Mercer, or is she just using the name?" Eli stepped off the porch. "What is your business?" "I am inquiring on behalf of her family back east. They are concerned about her welfare and her moral standing." "She is fine," Eli said, "and she is where she wants to be." Finch looked at the cabin. "It is a long way to fall, from a parlor to a shack. Tell her brother sends his regards, and tell her that hiding does not erase the past." He turned his horse and rode off. That night, the silence in the cabin was heavy. Clara sat by the fire, her face pale. "You heard him?" Eli asked. Clara nodded. He mentioned a parlor. Eli said, "You are not just a poor relation, are you, Clara?" Clara looked into the flames. "No, my father was wealthy once. When he died, the debts ate everything. My brother, he arranged the marriage to your uncle, but it was not just about money." She turned to Eli, her eyes wet. "I was compromised. A man in our town. He was important. He forced himself on me. When I told my brother, he said I was a liar. He said I had seduced him. I was ruined. Eli, damaged goods. Sending me here was a disposal, a way to erase the scandal. She hugged her knees. I chose the mountains because the alternative was being broken in a parlor, married off to some other man who would punish me for a sin I didn't commit. Eli listened, his heart hardening into a stone in his chest. He looked at his own hands, scarred and rough. I left the logging camps 5 years ago, Eli said, his voice low. Clara looked up. There was a fight, Eli said, over a woman, a camp follower. The foreman was beating her. I told him to stop. He pulled a knife. Eli looked at the fire. I didn't mean to kill him, but I hit him hard. And when he went down, he didn't get up. I drifted west, to get away from the law. Maybe, but mostly to get away from myself. I have a violence in me. Clara, I keep it buried. But it is there. He looked at her. I do not know if I am protecting you, or if I am just using you to prove I am not a monster. Clara reached out. She touched his hand. Her fingers were cool, but her touch was steady. She did not flinch. You are not a monster. Eli, a monster would have left me in the river. Their attraction grew in the spaces between the words. It was in the shared laughter when Clara burnt the biscuits and Eli ate them anyway, claiming he liked the crunch. It was in the way Eli watched her braid her hair by the firelight, the heavy plait shining like copper. It was in the way Clara watched him tend to a wounded fox he'd found in a trap, his big hands incredibly gentle as he set the broken leg. Then came the blizzard. It hit in late January, a white wall that slammed into the valley and buried the cabin to the eaves. The temperature dropped so low the nails in the logs popped like gunshots. On the second night, the wind blew out the pilot on the stove. The cold rushed in instantly. We cannot keep the heat up, Eli said, seeing their breath plume in the room. He looked at the bedrolls. We have to combine them. Clara nodded. She understood. It was survival. They laid the furs together on the floor. They lay down, fully clothed, wrapped in everything they owned. The closeness was suffocating and intoxicating. Eli lay on his back, Clara on her side facing him. He could feel her breath on his neck. He could feel the length of her body against his leg. They lay in the dark, the wind howling outside, their bodies learning each other without moving. Eli? Clara whispered. Yeah, are you asleep? No. She shifted. Her hand moved, finding his in the dark. She interlaced her fingers with his. I am not afraid of you, she whispered. Eli turned his head. Her face was inches from his. He could see the glint of her eyes. You should be, he rasped. Clara moved closer. She initiated it. She pressed her lips to his. It was hesitant at first, a question. Then, when he didn't pull away, it became hungry. It was a kiss that tasted of desperation and hope. It tested whether tenderness could exist without a price. Eli responded like a starving man. He groaned low in his throat, his hand coming up to cup her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. For a moment, the world fell away. There was only her, the softness of her mouth, the heat of her body. Then, the shame hit him. He was taking advantage. He was the protector, and here he was, mauling her in the dark like the brute the town thought he was. He pulled back, gasping, shaking. No, he said, no, I cannot. Clara lay still, her breathing ragged. Eli, I cannot be that man, Eli said, rolling away from her to the edge of the blankets. I won't be that man. The next morning, the storm broke, but the peace was shattered by a gunshot. Crack! The sound echoed off the valley walls. A spray of snow kicked up 10 feet from the porch. Eli grabbed his rifle and was out the door in seconds. He scanned the ridge. Nothing. He tracked the shot. He found boot prints near the tree line. They led back toward the town. But near the prints, he found something else. A survey stake, hidden in the brush. It marked a line that cut right through the cabin's garden. He walked back to the cabin, his face grim. It was a warning, Eli said, tossing the stake onto the table. And this is the land agent. He is not asking any more. He is taking... Clara looked at the stake. She looked at Eli. The fear was gone from her face, replaced by a cold anger. We cannot keep hiding, she said. We can hold them off. Eli said, I can fortify the cabin. No, Clara said. That is just waiting to die. I want a lawful answer. Eli, I want papers. I want proof. I want a name that cannot be stolen by men like Sterling or my brother. Law is just another weapon out here, Eli argued. Then we pick up the weapon, Clara said. She walked to her valise. She pulled out the letter from Silas, the one that had brought her here, the promise. She walked to Eli and placed it in his hand. Read it, she said. I know what it says. Read the date. Eli. He looked. October 12th. He died November 1st. Clara said, but he wrote this letter, and he mailed a copy to the land office in Denver. He told me he did, to register his intent to marry. So, Clara said, her voice rising. If he registered his intent, then under the Homestead Act, his claim might be protected for his heirs. For his intended. She looked him in the eye. But I am not his intended anymore. She reached out and closed Eli's fingers over the letter. I am done being a bargain. Eli, I am done being promised. If we do this, if we fight them, I need to know why we are doing it. Eli looked at the crumpled paper. He looked at the woman who had walked through a blizzard to find a dead man, and instead found him. You want a choice, he said. I want to be a choice, Clara said. Yours, public, dangerous, and real, or nothing at all. Eli tightened his grip on the letter. He looked at the rifle by the door, then back at Clara. Get your coat, he said. We are going to find a judge. The trail to the county seat was a scar cut into the side of the mountain, buried under 2 feet of fresh drift. The wind did not just blow. It screamed through the pines, a high, thin sound that vibrated in the teeth. Eli rode the roan mare, breaking the trail, while Clara rode the pack horse behind him. Her head bowed against the biting sleet. It took them 6 hours to cover distance that usually took 3. When they finally tied the horses outside the county clerk's office, the animals were rimmed with frost, their heads hanging low. Clara slid from the saddle, her legs numb, stumbling as her boots hit the frozen mud of the street. Eli caught her arm, steadying her. Stand tall, he murmured, his voice rough from the cold. Do not let them see you shiver. Clara nodded, straightening her spine by sheer force of will. She smoothed her wind-battered coat and followed him inside. The office smelled of stale tobacco smoke, ink, and dry paper. A clerk with ink-stained cuffs and eyes that darted like a nervous rodent sat behind a high desk. He looked up, squinting through spectacles. I need the file on the Mercer claim, Eli said, leaning his hands on the counter. Parcel 4, Section 9, Upper Valley. The clerk, a man named Abernathy, cleared his throat. Mercer, yes, Silas Mercer. He moved to the wall of filing cabinets, pulling open a drawer. He rifled through the papers, his fingers moving a little too fast. He stopped, frowned, and checked the label. He checked the drawer above and the drawer below. That is peculiar, Abernathy mumbled. What is? Eli asked. It seems the file is misplaced. Eli's jaw tightened. A land claim does not just get misplaced. Abernathy. It is a legal document. Abernathy wiped his forehead. Though the room was drafty, I am sure it is just a filing error. Mr. Mercer, with the new survey being conducted by Mr. Sterling's company, many files have been pulled for reference. Pulled by who? Clara asked, her voice sharp. Abernathy looked at her, then away. By the relevant authorities. Ma'am? Eli reached across the counter, gripping the man's wrist. The machinery of theft was quiet, but Eli could hear the gears turning. Find it, Eli said. I cannot find what is not there, Abernathy squeaked. Pulling back. You will have to speak to the sheriff. He has jurisdiction over contested properties. They found Sheriff Halloway at the saloon, not the jail. He was sitting at a corner table, nursing a whiskey, his boots propped on a chair. He was a big man, heavy in the gut but with arms like oak limbs. When Eli and Clara approached, he didn't stand. He just smiled, a slow spreading of lips that showed yellow teeth. Sheriff, Eli said, Aye. The clerk says you have my uncle's file. Halloway took a sip of whiskey. Is that what he said? Abernathy talks too much. I want the file. Halloway. And I want to know why Sterling is running lines on my land. Your land, Halloway chuckled. That is the question, isn't it? Silas died without a clear will filed in this county. That makes the claim fluid. I have the will, Eli said, tapping his coat pocket, and I have the woman he betrothed. Halloway's eyes slid to Clara. He looked her up and down, a gaze that felt like a dirty thumb smear on a clean window. The betrothed, he drawled. Right, the mail-order bride who showed up too late. Tell me, miss, what is the legal term for a woman who lives with a man she isn't married to? Clara went rigid. I am his guest, sheriff. Halloway laughed. A wet, ugly sound. Guest. That is a polite word for the old man's leftover. The insult landed like a physical slap. Clara's face flamed with humiliation, but beneath it, Eli felt a surge of rage so pure it nearly blinded him. His hand twitched toward the Colt on his hip. Halloway saw it. His hand hovered near his own gun. Go ahead, mountain man. Give me a reason. I will hang you before sundown, and the girl will be working the upstairs rooms by midnight. Eli forced his hand to relax. He breathed in through his nose, the smell of whiskey and sawdust filling his lungs. He was not the man he used to be. He would not give them the satisfaction. We are leaving, Eli said, but this isn't over. As they walked out, Clara felt the eyes of every man in the room on her back. They stripped her down to her shame, making her feel cheap, used, and small. Outside, the cold air felt clean after the rot of the saloon. I need a moment, Clara whispered. She saw a small sign down the street, midwife and herbalist. Without waiting for Eli, she walked toward it. Eli watched her go, then turned toward the undertaker's shop. He had his own questions. Inside the midwife's shop, the air smelled of dried sage and lavender. A woman with gray hair and hands that looked like twisted roots was grinding herbs in a mortar. She looked up as Clara entered. You look like you have been slapped. Child, the woman said. Sit. Clara sat. The kindness, unexpected and simple, broke the dam. She didn't weep, but she began to talk. She told the midwife, a woman named Mrs. Higgins, about the journey, about the sheriff, about the town's whispers. They look at me like I am dirt. Clara said, people fear what they cannot control. Mrs. Higgins said, pouring tea from a kettle on the stove. And a woman alone, or a woman making her own choices, terrifies them. Clara looked into the teacup. It wasn't my choice. Not at first. My family. They sent me away. There was a man. He was powerful. He hurt me. And when I told, they said I tempted him. They said I was ruined. Marrying me off to a stranger in the mountains was their way of sweeping the glass under the rug. Mrs. Higgins reached out and covered Clara's hand. You are not glass, my dear, and you are not dirt. You are iron. You just have to stay in the fire long enough to find your shape. Meanwhile, Eli was speaking to the undertaker, a sour-faced man who seemed to prefer the dead to the living. Silas Mercer, Eli said. You prepared him. I did. The sheriff called it an accident. Said he fell. The undertaker wiped his hands on a rag. Neck was broke. That is true enough. Found him at the bottom of the ravine near the timber line. Did he have anything on him? Not much. Knife, pipe, his watch? Eli asked. Silas had a silver pocket watch he never took off. It had a train engraved on the lid. The undertaker shook his head. No watch. Sheriff's deputy brought the body in. Said his pockets were empty. Eli nodded, his suspicion hardening into certainty. Silas hadn't fallen. He had been pushed, and whoever did it had picked his pockets before the body was cold. The ride back to the cabin was silent, fueled by a shared, simmering anger. They reached the valley as the sun was bleeding out behind the peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow. The door to the cabin was standing open. Eli drew his rifle before his horse even stopped moving. Stay here, he ordered. He approached the cabin, boots crunching on the crust. He kicked the door wide, sweeping the room with the muzzle of the Winchester. Clear. He lowered the gun. Clara, come look. They stood in the doorway. The cabin had been tossed. The mattress was slashed, feathers scattered like snow. The drawers of the dresser were overturned. The flour bin was dumped on the floor. They were looking for something. Clara whispered, stepping over a pile of Silas's old clothes. Papers, Eli said. Proof of the claim. Or maybe letters. Clara went to her valise, which was lying open in the corner. She checked the lining. "My letters from home are gone," she said, her voice shaking. "The ones from my brother. They want leverage," Eli said. "They want to squeeze us from both sides." Clara sank onto the ruined mattress. The violation of it, strangers touching her things, invading this one small place of safety, was too much. She began to shake, a violent trembling that she couldn't stop. "I cannot do this," she gasped. "I cannot live like prey. Eli, I spent my whole life looking over my shoulder, waiting for the blow. I thought it would stop here." Eli looked at her. He saw the terror that had been her constant companion for years. He crossed the room, stepping over the debris, and knelt in front of her. He dropped the rifle and took her hands. They were ice cold. "Look at me, Clara." She raised her eyes, swimming with tears. "No one is going to take you," he said. His voice was low, vibrating with a ferocity that surprised him. "I will burn this whole valley to ash before I let them touch you again." "You cannot fight them all," she whispered. "Watch me." He pulled her up from the mattress. He didn't let go of her hands. The fear in the room was thick, but beneath it, something else was rising, a desperate need for connection, for an anchor in the storm. "Hold me," Clara said. "Please, just hold me. Do not take, just hold." Eli sat on the bench and pulled her into his lap. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He held her with a steady, crushing pressure, like he was trying to hold her pieces together. They sat like that for hours as the cabin grew dark. He didn't move to kiss her. He didn't let his hands wander. He just let her set the pace, let the desire ache in his chest without forcing it into violence. It was an intimacy deeper than skin, a silent vow made in the dark. The next day, the threat materialized. Eli was at the woodpile, splitting logs to replace the heat they had lost. Clara was inside, sweeping up the flour. 2 men rode out of the tree line. They didn't speak. They just rode straight for Eli, horses kicking up snow. One of them swung a heavy quirt, aiming for Eli's head. Eli ducked, the leather whistle missing him by an inch. He swung the axe, not the blade, but the handle, catching the rider in the ribs. The man grunted and fell from the saddle. The second man drew a pistol. Eli didn't have his gun. He lunged, tackling the man off the horse. They hit the snow in a tangle of limbs. The man was strong, smelling of sweat and whiskey. He landed a punch to Eli's jaw, snapping his head back. Eli roared, a sound of pure animal fury. He drove his knee into the man's stomach and slammed a fist into his face. Once, twice. Clara appeared on the porch, Eli's rifle in her hands. "Get off him!" she screamed. She fired a shot into the air. The crack was deafening. The men scrambled up, battered and bleeding. They looked at Eli, then at the woman with the smoking rifle and eyes like flint. They didn't wait. They grabbed their horses and fled back toward the timber. Eli stood in the snow, chest heaving, blood dripping from a cut on his cheek. The adrenaline was coursing through him like liquid fire. He turned and walked toward the porch. Clara lowered the rifle, her chest rising and falling rapidly. They stared at each other. The violence of the moment had stripped away the last layers of pretense. The fear of death had sharpened the need for life. Eli walked up the steps. He took the rifle from her hand and set it against the wall. Then he took her face in his hands. "Are you hurt?" he asked roughly. "No," she whispered. "You? I am fine." He kissed her. This time, there was no hesitation. It was a collision. Clara made a sound in her throat and gripped his coat, pulling him closer. They stumbled inside, kicking the door shut. The cabin was cold, but the heat between them was blistering. Eli backed her against the wall, his hands tangling in her hair. "Clara," he gasped, pulling back for a second to look at her. "I need you to say it." "Say what? That you want this?" That it is you choosing. I choose you, she said, her voice fierce. I choose this. He picked her up, carrying her to the bedroll. Clothes were loosened with frantic, fumbling hands. The boundaries they had set were spoken aloud and then crossed, not with carelessness, but with reverence. When he entered her, she didn't flinch. She met him, rap for rap, breath for breath. It wasn't just heat, it was a reclaiming. For Clara, it was the first time her body belonged to her, shared willingly. For Eli, it was the realization that he wasn't broken, that his hands could create pleasure instead of just pain. The night became less about the act and more about the connection, a desperate, terrifyingly beautiful choice to belong to each other in a world that wanted to tear them apart. Morning brought the gray light of winter and the return of reality. Eli woke first. He lay watching the dust motes dance in the light. Clara was asleep on his arm, her hair spread like a copper fan across his chest. Fear spiked in him. He had taken the woman he was supposed to protect. He had become exactly what the gossip said he was. Clara stirred. She opened her eyes, and for a moment, he saw the shadow of her old fear. Then, she looked at him, and it cleared. She sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. She looked at the bruises on his face from the fight. You are thinking too much, she said softly. I compromised you. Eli said, you loved me. She corrected. There is a difference. She reached for her clothes, but you are right to worry. I have not paid for safety. Eli, I know that, but the town, they will use this. She dressed quickly, her movements decisive. She turned to him, buttoning her bodice. Marry me, she said. Eli sat up. Clara, I mean it, not for romance, not for a fairy tale. For armor, she paced the floor. If we are married, legally, on paper, they cannot call me a whore. They cannot say I'm a vagrant. The law protects a wife in ways it does not protect a stray. It gives me a name they have to respect. Eli shook his head. If you marry me, you tie yourself to a man with nothing but a shack and a bad reputation. I will ruin you. Clara, you think I am not already ruined in their eyes? She asked. She knelt by the bed. Eli, look at me. I'm already fighting. I'm already standing in the mud. I need you to stand with me. Eli looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes. He realized that refusing her now wasn't nobility. It was just another form of control. It was deciding for her what was best. Okay, he said. Okay? We will go today, before the snow starts again. The ceremony at the courthouse was small, tense, and devoid of joy. A bored judge presided, rushing through the words as if he had a train to catch. Henderson, the shopkeeper, and the nervous clerk, Abernathy, stood as witnesses, dragged in from the hall. Townspeople watched from the open door, whispering. They were spectators at a hanging, waiting for the rope to snap. When the judge asked Clara for her name, she didn't hesitate. Clara Mercer, she said clearly. Her voice did not break. She spoke it like she was planting a flag. The judge signed the paper. It is done. They walked out into the cold sunlight as man and wife. But there was no rice thrown, no cheers, just the cold stares of a town that hated to be proven wrong. They had barely reached the horses when the land agent, Sterling, stepped off the boardwalk. He was flanked by Sheriff Halloway. A touching scene, Sterling said, clapping his gloved hands. Truly, but I am afraid your domestic bliss is about to be interrupted. Get out of my way. Sterling, Eli said. I have filed a petition, Sterling said, pulling a paper from his coat, alleging that the documents proving your uncle's claim are forgeries, and that you, Eli Mercer, are squatting on company land. He handed the paper to the sheriff. Pending an investigation, Halloway said, smirking. The property is to be seized. You have 24 hours to vacate. It is a lie. Clara said, Is it? Sterling smiled. We shall see. Before Eli could respond, a carriage rolled down the street, a fancy rig, wholly out of place in the mud. It stopped, and a man stepped out. He wore a tailored suit and a look of supreme arrogance. Clara gasped, Thomas, It was her brother. He looked at Clara with a mixture of pity and disgust. Clara, he said, look at you. You look like a savage. Go away. Thomas, Clara said, I have come to bring you home. He said, the family is willing to forgive this indiscretion. If you come now, he looked at Eli, and you, kidnapper, you will release her immediately. Eli stepped forward, but Clara put a hand on his chest. I am not kidnapped. Thomas, I am married. Thomas laughed. To this animal, it is not a marriage. Clara, it is a tragedy. Now get in the carriage. Clara stepped away from Eli. She stood alone in the center of the muddy street. She looked at her brother, then at the sheriff, then at the townspeople watching. No, she said. The word rang out. I was sold to cover your debts. Thomas, I was sent here like a parcel because you were too cowardly to face the man who hurt me. Thomas's face went purple. Silence! I will not be silent, Clara shouted. I am not stolen goods. I am not ashamed to be hidden. I am Clara Mercer, and I would rather freeze in a cabin with an honest man than live in a palace with liars like you. The silence that followed was absolute. Some of the women on the boardwalk looked down, shame coloring their cheeks. The spell of the town's judgment cracked. They saw not a whore, but a woman pushed to the edge who refused to jump. Let's go home. Eli, Clara said. They rode out of town, leaving her brother shouting impotent threats in the mud. Back at the cabin, the reality of the 24-hour deadline set in. They had to find proof, real proof. Eli went to Silas's old trunk, the one the intruders had searched. They tossed it. Eli said, but Silas was clever. He dragged the heavy trunk to the center of the room. He emptied it completely. Then, he took his knife and pried up the bottom slat of wood. It popped loose. Beneath it was a shallow compartment. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a thin leather book and a folded map. Eli opened the book. It was a ledger, but not for pelts. It lists payments, Eli said, tracing the lines, dates, amounts. Look here. Halloway, $50. Abernathy, $20. And this, Clara said, unfolding the map. It was a survey map of the valley, but it had lines drawn in red ink that didn't match the official ones, and scrawled in the margin. In Silas's hand, Sterling offered $2,000. I refused. He said the mountain has accidents. If I die, check the timber line. He knew. Clara whispered. He was blackmailed, and when he wouldn't sell, they killed him. We have them, Eli said. This proves the conspiracy. It proves the murder. The sound of hoofbeats thundered outside. Lots of them. Eli grabbed his rifle. Clara grabbed the shotgun. They went to the window. Down the valley, a posse was riding up. Sheriff Halloway was in the lead, a piece of paper waving in his hand. They are coming, Clara said. Eli looked at her. He saw the fear. Yes, but he saw the iron misses. Higgins had talked about. They are coming for our home, Eli said. Clara gripped his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. Then they will have to look us in the eye when they take it, she said. The warrant slammed onto the table, rattling the kerosene lamp. Sheriff Halloway stood in the doorway of the cabin, his chest heaving from the ride up the mountain, a malicious grin splitting his beard. Behind him, 4 deputies crowded the porch, rifles leveled. You are under arrest. Eli Mercer, Halloway announced. On what charge? Eli asked, his voice low and dangerous. He stood in front of Clara, shielding her with his body. Forgery, Halloway spat. That will is a fake, and assault on a land agent surveyor. And let us throw in squatting on corporate land for good measure. It is a lie, Clara said, stepping out from behind Eli. Her voice was shaking, but clear. We have proof. Halloway ignored her. Take him, and if he resists, shoot him. It would save the county the cost of a trial. Eli looked at the rifles. He looked at Halloway's itching finger on the trigger. Then he looked at Clara. If he fought, the cabin would turn into a slaughterhouse. Bullets would tear through the wood, through the air, through her. He slowly raised his hands. No! Clara screamed, grabbing his arm. Eli, no! I am going with them! "Clara," Eli said, not taking his eyes off Holloway. "Do not fight them." "Not here." Two deputies rushed in, grabbing Eli roughly. They spun him around, slamming his face into the rough-hewn wall. Clara heard the sickening click of handcuffs ratcheting tight. The sheriff turned to Clara. "As for you, Miss, since you are not legally a resident and this cabin is now seized as evidence, you have 1 hour to pack your personal effects and get out." "This is our home," Clara cried. "It is the company's property," Holloway corrected. "Deputy Griggs will stay here to ensure you do not steal anything of value. You can ride your horse down, or you can walk. I do not care which." They dragged Eli out. He twisted his head back to look at her one last time. "Go to Mrs. Higgins," he shouted. "Clara, go to—" A deputy struck him in the stomach with a rifle butt. Eli doubled over, gasping. They threw him onto a horse, tying his feet beneath the belly. Clara watched them ride away, the sound of hooves muffled by the snow. She was alone in the cabin with Deputy Griggs, a man with watery eyes and a mouth that hung open. "You heard the sheriff?" Griggs grunted, leaning against the doorframe. "Get packing." Clara stood frozen. The old terror, the one she thought she had buried, clawed its way up her throat. She was trapped. A man with power held her fate in his hands. The walls of the cabin, once her sanctuary, felt like the walls of a cage. But then she looked at the table. The ledger and the map were gone. She had hidden them in her skirts the moment she heard the horses. She felt the outline of the hard leather cover against her thigh. She was not that girl in the parlor anymore. She was a woman who had crossed the Rockies in winter. She was the wife of a mountain man. She did not pack clothes. She packed food, dried meat, biscuits, a small tin of coffee. She packed a knife. She packed the box of cartridges she had found under the floorboards. "Where are you going?" Griggs asked as she brushed past him, her head high. "To town," Clara said. Griggs laughed. "Sheriff said you could go. Did not say you would find a welcome." Clara ignored him. She saddled the pack horse, her hands moving with practiced speed despite the cold that numbed her fingers. She mounted, turned the horse's head down the valley, and rode. The wind was a physical weight, pushing against her chest. The snow had started again. Small, hard pellets that stung like buckshot. Every mile was a battle. The horse stumbled in drifts. Branches whipped her face, leaving stinging red welts. She did not stop. She let the anger burn in her belly, hotter than the fear. They thought they had broken her. They thought she would fade away into the snow. They were wrong. She reached the settlement at dusk. The town was shutting down against the cold, windows glowing with yellow light. She rode straight to the small house at the edge of town with the sign, "Midwife and Herbalist, Mrs." Higgins opened the door, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She took one look at Clara, windburned, eyes wild, shivering violently, and pulled her inside. "Child, Mrs." Higgins said, "What happened?" "They took him." Clara gasped, the warmth of the room making her dizzy. "They took Eli. They said he forged the will." "Mrs." Higgins cursed, a sharp, unladylike word. "Sit, drink this." She poured a cup of bitter tea. Clara drank it, the heat spreading through her chest. "I need help. Mrs. Higgins," Clara said, "I have the proof. I have Silas's ledger. It shows he was paying them off. Mrs." Higgins nodded grimly. "That is why they took Eli. To silence him before he could use it. And to leave you vulnerable so you would run." "I am not running," Clara said. Clara spent the night on a pallet in the midwife's kitchen. She did not sleep. She listened to the wind and planned. The next morning, she walked onto the main street. The reaction was immediate. Women crossed the street to avoid her. Men stopped talking and stared, their expressions ranging from amusement to open hostility. "There she is," a woman whispered loud enough to be heard. "The shameless one, living in sin with a murderer," another added, "and now begging in the street." Clara walked with her chin up, staring straight ahead. The insults carved her open inside, reopening old wounds of shame and rejection. She felt dirty. She felt exposed, but she did not collapse. She walked into the general store. Henderson, the shopkeeper, looked up. He hesitated, glancing at the other customers. "I cannot serve you, Mrs. Mercer," he said quietly. "The sheriff. He said anyone aiding a suspect could be charged as an accessory." "I am not asking for credit." "Henderson," Clara said, "I am asking if you are a man who likes being told what to sell by a crook like Holloway." Henderson looked at her. He looked at the land agent's office across the street. He hated the monopoly Sterling was building. He hated the way the town was changing. He reached under the counter and slid a small sack of coffee and a loaf of bread toward her. "On the house," he muttered. "Go out the back." It was a small victory, but it was fuel. In the jail, Eli was learning the texture of the stone floor. They had put him in the solitary cell in the basement, a damp, rat-infested hole. 2 men had come in an hour ago. They were not deputies. They were hired muscle, paid to teach him humility. They had used clubs. Eli sat in the corner, spitting blood. His left eye was swollen shut. His ribs felt like a bag of broken china. "You forged that will, didn't you, Mercer?" one of them had said between blows. "Just sign the confession." Eli had said nothing. He had curled into a ball, protecting his head, and endured. Now, alone in the dark, the rage was a living thing in the cell with him. He wanted to kill them. He knew how. He could snap a neck as easily as a dry branch. The old violence, the darkness he had fled the logging camps to escape, whispered to him. Kill them all. Break the bars. Burn the town. But then he thought of Clara. If he killed a deputy, he would hang. And if he hung, Clara was alone. He had to live. He had to endure. He had to be the man she believed he was, not the monster he feared he was. A noise at the heavy iron door upstairs. Footsteps. The door to the cell block creaked open. 5 minutes, a voice said. And keep it quiet. It was Mrs. Higgins' voice. Clara, Eli rasped, pulling himself up to the bars. Eli, she was there. Her face was pressed against the iron, tear-streaked and beautiful. She reached through the bars, her hands grasping for him. He stumbled forward. He took her hands. Her fingers were warm. Oh, God. Eli, she whispered, looking at his battered face. What have they done? I am all right, he lied, leaning his forehead against the cold metal. It looks worse than it is. Are you safe? I am with Mrs. Higgins, Eli. I have the ledger. I have the map. Keep them hidden, Eli hissed. Do not show them to anyone yet, not until we can find a federal judge. The local court is bought and paid for. They are going to move you, Clara said, her voice trembling. Mrs. Higgins heard the deputies talking. Tonight, at midnight, they are moving you to the territorial prison. Eli's blood ran cold. The road to the territorial prison went through the canyon. It was the perfect place for a prisoner to try to escape and be shot in the back. They are not taking me to prison. Clara, Eli said softly. They are taking me to a ditch. No, Clara said. No, Clara, listen to me. You have to leave. Take the horse. Go to the railhead in Durango. Get out of here. I am not leaving you, she hissed, gripping his hands so tight her nails dug into his skin. I told you, Eli. I choose this. I choose you. Time is up, the guard shouted from the stairs. Clara leaned in, pressing her lips to his knuckles through the bars. Be ready, she whispered. Midnight. Clara walked out of the jail into the blinding white of the afternoon sun. She turned the corner and ran straight into a wall of expensive wool. Clara. She looked up. It was Thomas, her brother. He looked at her with a mixture of pity and revulsion. You look like a beggar, he said. Get out of my way. Thomas, I have a ticket for you, he said, holding out an envelope. The train leaves tomorrow. We can tell everyone you were delirious with grief. We can fix this. Clara, come home. Home? Clara laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. To the house where you told me to be quiet? To the parlor where you sold me to cover your bad investments? I was protecting the family. Thomas snapped. You were protecting yourself. I am not coming back. Thomas, I would rather die in these mountains than live one more day in your debt. She pushed past him. Miss Mercer? Another voice. Smoother. Oiler. Archibald Sterling stood on the boardwalk, twirling a cane. "A tragic situation," he said. "Truly. But it can be resolved." He held out a pouch. It was heavy, gold heavy. $500, Sterling said. "Enough for a fresh start in California. New name, new clothes. No one needs to know about your time here." Clara looked at the pouch. It was more money than she had ever seen. It was safety. It was escape. "And Eli?" she asked. "Mr. Mercer has made his choices," Sterling said, his smile tight. "He is a criminal. You are a victim. Take the money. Clara, be smart." Clara looked at the money, then at Sterling's polished boots. "You think you can buy everything, don't you?" she said. "You buy land. You buy the law. You think you can buy me. Everyone has a price," Sterling said. "Not me," Clara said. She slapped the pouch from his hand. It hit the mud with a heavy thud. Coins spilled out, glittering in the filth. "Keep your money, Mr. Sterling. You are going to need it for your lawyer." She walked away, leaving the two men staring after her. She went back to Mrs. Higgins' house. "We have to get him out," Clara said, pacing the kitchen. "Tonight, Mrs." Higgins wiped her hands on her apron. "It is suicide. Child. There are 3 deputies." "We do not need to fight them," Clara said. "We just need to blind them." She looked at the shelves of herbs. "Do you have laudanum?" "I do." "And whiskey?" "Always." At 11 o'clock that night, Mrs. Higgins walked to the jailhouse carrying a covered basket. The wind was howling, a full blizzard kicking up, masking the sound of her approach. "Evening, boys," she called out to the deputy on the porch. "Brought some stew and coffee. Shame to make you work on a night like this." The deputy, shivering and miserable, waved her inside. 2 other men were playing cards. They smelled the stew and the fresh coffee. "You are a saint, Mrs. Higgins," one said. "I put a little drop of comfort in the coffee." She winked to keep the cold out. They drank it. They ate the stew. Clara watched from the alley, shivering in the snow, clutching a heavy iron pry bar she had stolen from the blacksmith. 20 minutes later, the lights in the jail office didn't go out, but the conversation stopped. Clara crept to the window. The 3 men were slumped over the desk and in their chairs, snoring heavily. She signaled Mrs. Higgins, who unlocked the front door from the inside. "Quickly, Mrs." Higgins whispered. "The keys are on the desk." Clara grabbed the ring of keys. She ran down the stairs to the basement. "Eli! He was awake. He heard the keys jingling. Clara, stand back." She fumbled with the lock. Her hands were shaking. The key turned with a heavy clack. The door swung open. Eli stumbled out. He could barely walk. Clara grabbed his arm, hoisting his weight onto her shoulder. "We have to go," she grunted. "Now." They made it up the stairs. Mrs. Higgins pressed a Colt revolver into Eli's hand and a heavy coat over his shoulders. "Go, Mrs." Higgins said. "My nephew left 2 horses saddled behind the livery. Take the high trail." "Thank you," Eli rasped. "Go!" They burst out into the storm. The cold was a shock, but the freedom was electric. They found the horses. Eli struggled into the saddle, gritting his teeth against the pain in his ribs. Clara mounted the other. They rode for the timberline, but the laudanum hadn't worked perfectly on everyone. As they cleared the edge of town, a shout went up. "Jailbreak! They're escaping!" A shot rang out. "Wild in the wind! Ride!" Eli shouted. They pushed the horses into the deep snow, heading up the mountain. Behind them, lanterns flared. The pursuit was on. They rode for an hour, the horses chest-deep in drifts, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The storm was their ally and their enemy. It hid their tracks, but it blinded them to the drops. "We cannot make the pass." Eli shouted over the wind. "The horses are done! We have to ditch them!" Clara yelled back. They slid off the exhausted animals, slapping their rumps to send them running down the valley to confuse the trail. "We climb," Eli said. They scrambled up a steep ravine, slipping on hidden ice. Eli's injuries slowed him down. He fell twice, gasping, clutching his side each time. Clara was there, pulling him up. "Come on, Eli, come on!" They found a rock shelter, a shallow cave under a granite overhang. Halfway up the ridge, It was small, cramped, but dry. They collapsed inside, huddled together in the dark. The wind screamed outside. A frustrated predator denied its meal. Eli leaned his head back against the stone, his breath rattling in his chest. Clara checked the revolver. 5 rounds. Are you with me? She asked, touching his face. I am with you, he whispered. The cold began to seep into their bones. They had no fire. They had only each other. We have to share heat, Eli said. It is the only way. Clara nodded. She moved to him. They huddled under the coat misses. Higgins had given him. The proximity was intense. In the jail, through the bars. It had been desperation. Here, in the dark, with death hunting them outside. It was raw and essential. Clara could feel the heat radiating from him. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her back. I was afraid, she whispered into the dark. Of the storm? Eli asked. Of this, of wanting you. Eli went still. Before, with the man back east, desire was a trap. Clara said it was something used against me. It meant I was weak. It meant I was bad. She turned in his arms to face him. Her hand found his chest. But with you, it feels like returning to my own body. It feels like I am finally inhabiting myself again. Eli's hand came up. He hovered his fingers over her waist. Not touching, just asking. May I? He whispered. Yes, Clara breathed. His hand settled on her waist, warm and heavy. He pulled her closer. May I kiss you? He asked. Yes, he kissed her. It was slow. It was a question asked and answered in the movement of lips. It was a reclaiming. His hand moved to the buttons of her bodice. He stopped. May I? Clara covered his hand with hers. She didn't stop him. She pressed his hand against her skin. Yes, Eli, yes, in the freezing dark. With the storm raging, they found a fire that had nothing to do with wood or coal. It was the heat of survival, and the heat of love that had been tested in the crucible of violence. Clara wept, not from pain, but from the relief of being touched without fear, of being held by a man who asked before he took, who treated her pleasure as a gift, not a right. They slept in a tangle of limbs, warm and safe for a few hours. Morning brought a blinding, brilliant sun. The storm had scrubbed the sky clean. Eli woke first. He was stiff, sore, but alive. He crawled to the mouth of the cave to check the valley below. The snow was pristine, unbroken white. No deputies yet. They had lost the trail. He looked down at the ground near the cave entrance. The wind had scoured the snow away from a patch of rocky earth. Something unnatural stuck out of the ground. Clara, he said, come look at this. Clara crawled out, blinking in the light. What is it? Eli brushed the snow away from a wooden stake driven deep into the frozen ground. It was an old survey marker, weathered gray. He pulled it out. On the side, carved into the wood, were initials, SM, Silas Mercer, and a date, 1885. And below that, scratched deep with a knife, True Line. This is it, Eli said, his voice rising. This is the original corner marker. He stood up, looking down the valley. Sterling's map shows the line half a mile west, cutting through the cabin. But this proves the cabin is on the patent land. It proves the company is stealing the timber. And it proves Silas knew. Clara said, that is why he marked it. And that is why they killed him. She looked at Eli. We have the ledger, we have the map, and now we have the marker. We have enough to hang them, Eli said. He looked at the rifle. Or enough to shoot them. We could ambush them in the canyon, Eli said, the dark thought surfacing. Holloway, Sterling, we could end it today. Clara put a hand on his arm. No, she said. Eli looked at her. They tried to kill us. Clara, they beat me. They humiliated you. And if we kill them, we are just murderers. Clara said, we become what they say we are. She took the stake from his hand. We are not running anymore, Eli, and we are not hiding in the dark. We are going back. To town? Eli asked. They will shoot us on sight. Not if we go to the one man they cannot bribe. Clara said, who? The federal marshal. You said he passes through on the stage to Silverton on Thursdays. That is today. Eli realized. If we stop that stage, Clara said, and we show him this, then Holloway has to answer to the federal government, Eli finished. He looked at Clara. She stood in the snow, her hair wild, her dress torn, holding the piece of wood like a sword. She looked magnificent. You are a dangerous woman. Clara Mercer, Eli said, a grin cracking his bruised lip. Only when I have to be, she said. Let's go, Eli said. Let's go take back our home. The snow had turned to slush in the lower valley, a gray, churning mess that sucked at the boots of horses and men alike. It was an ugly season, the time between the purity of winter and the green of spring, where everything hidden under the snow was revealed, rotting logs, broken wheels, and the mud that made up the foundation of the town. Eli and Clara rode into the settlement not as fugitives, but as hunters. They did not hide in the alleyways. They rode down the center of the main street, the hooves of their borrowed mounts splashing heavily in the mire. Clara held the reins with gloved hands, her spine stiff, her eyes scanning the storefronts. She carried the survey stake wrapped in burlap behind her saddle, and the ledger was buttoned inside her coat, pressing against her heart like a second beat. They needed allies, and in a town owned by fear, allies were expensive. We go to the newspaper first, Clara said, her voice low. The Daily Mountain Gazette operated out of a storefront that smelled of ink and stale tobacco. Arthur Pendergast, the editor, was a man with ink-stained fingers and a cynicism that had been cured like leather by 20 years on the frontier. He looked up as they entered, his eyes widening at the sight of Eli's bruised face and the fierce determination in Clara's eyes. Mr. Pendergast, Clara said, placing her hands on his desk. I have a story that will sell more papers than the mining reports. Pendergast leaned back, chewing on a toothpick. The sheriff says you are wanted for forgery and vagrancy. Mrs. Mercer. The sheriff is a liar and a thief, Eli said, his voice rumbling in the small room. And we have the paper to prove it. Clara pulled the ledger from her coat. She opened it to the page where Silas Mercer's shaky hand had recorded the payments. She pointed to a line. August 12th. Sheriff Holloway, $50. Silence regarding the timber survey. And here, Clara said, turning the page. September 1st. Archibald Sterling. $200 offered for the deed. Refused. Threats made. Pendergast's eyes narrowed. He looked at the book, then at Clara. This is dynamite. Ma'am, if I print this, Holloway will burn this building down with me inside it. Not if the federal marshal is standing guard, Eli said. Pendergast raised an eyebrow. Marshal Grant. He is just passing through on the way to Silverton. He does not care about local squabbles. He cares about land fraud involving federal patents. Clara said, and he cares about murder. They found Marshal Cyrus Grant at the hotel, eating a steak with the precision of a surgeon. He was a man of iron-gray hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He listened to them without interrupting, his eyes moving from the ledger to the survey stake Eli had unwrapped on the table. This stake, Grant said, running a finger over the carved initials. You say you found it where? Buried under 2 feet of rock and snow, Eli said, 500 yards east of where Sterling claims the line is. Grant looked at the map Clara had spread out. If this stake is the true corner, then the Consolidated Mining Company has been harvesting timber on private land for 6 months. That is theft of federal resources before the patent was even issued. And the murder? Grant asked, looking at Eli. Eli pointed to the note in the ledger. If I die, check the timber line. My uncle was not a clumsy man. Marshal, Eli said, he was killed because he would not sign. Grant wiped his mouth with a napkin and stood up. He checked the heavy colt on his hip. I have a schedule to keep in Silverton, Grant said, but I hate a thief. And I despise a crooked badge. With the marshal's presence securing their safety, the town's dynamic began to shift. They needed more than law. They needed the town's weight. They went to Caleb Thorne, a rancher who had been fighting Sterling over water rights for 2 years. Thorne was a hard man with a face like a dried apple, but when he saw the ledger, He spat on the floor. "I knew it." Thorne growled. "I knew that snake was buying the law. You want backing? You have got it. My boys will ride with you." The coalition was formed, but secrets in a small town were like water in a sieve. By noon, Sterling knew they were there. The retaliation was swift and vicious. It did not come with guns, but with words. Clara was walking across the street to the dry goods store to speak with Henderson when Sterling stepped out of the barber shop. He was freshly shaved, smelling of bay rum, his suit immaculate despite the mud. "Mrs. Mercer," Sterling called out, his voice carrying over the noise of the street. "Or should I say, Miss Vance? Or perhaps you have another name you used in the parlors of St. Louis." The street went quiet. Men stopped loading wagons. Women paused on the boardwalks. Sterling smiled, a reptilian baring of teeth. "I received a telegram from your brother, my dear. He was quite explicit about your history. It seems you were very popular with the wealthy gentleman of the city, a woman of negotiable affection." The insult hung in the damp air. Sterling was banking on shame. He was banking on the fact that a woman would shrink, run, and hide to protect her reputation. Eli, standing by the horses, took a step forward, his hand going to his knife. Clara held up a hand. "Stop, Eli!" She turned to face Sterling. She did not shrink. She did not look down. She walked up the steps of the hotel porch so she stood above him. She looked at the women watching her, Mrs. Gable, the shopkeeper's wife, and the others who had whispered about her. "You want to talk about my past, Mr. Sterling," Clara said, her voice clear and ringing. "Let us talk about it." She looked at the town. "Yes, I was sold," she said. "My family fell into debt, and my brother sold me to a man with money to cover his mistakes. I was 18. I was terrified, and when I fought back, they told me I was ruined. They told me I was goods that had been damaged." She saw Mrs. Higgins in the crowd, nodding slowly. "I came west to escape men who think women are property." Clara continued. "I walked through a blizzard to get to that cabin. I survived the cold, I survived the wolves, and I survived the judgment of this town." She pointed a finger at Sterling. "You think you can shame me? You cannot shame a woman who has walked through hell and come out clean on the other side. I am not a victim. I am a survivor, and I am the wife of Eli Mercer." She looked Sterling in the eye. "And you, sir, are just a thief in a cheap suit." A murmur went through the crowd. It started low and rose. It was not the sound of scandal. It was the sound of respect. Sterling's smile faltered. He had tried to use the weapon of prejudice, and Clara had grabbed the blade with her bare hand and turned it back on him. The hearing took place an hour later in the back room of the saloon, which served as the temporary courthouse. The air was thick with smoke and tension. Marshal Grant sat at the head table, his federal badge gleaming dully. Sheriff Holloway stood near the bar, his hand resting on his gun, surrounded by 3 of his deputies. Sterling sat with his lawyer, looking bored, though a sheen of sweat on his upper lip betrayed him. Eli and Clara sat on the opposite side. Eli's hands were clenched on his knees. He watched Holloway. He knew the sheriff was cornered, and a cornered animal bites. The impulse to end it was a roar in Eli's blood. He could draw. He could put a bullet in Holloway's chest before the sheriff cleared leather. It would be justice. It would be clean. Clara placed her hand on his fist. "No," she whispered. "He killed Silas," Eli murmured. "I can see it in his eyes. If you kill him, the truth dies with him." Clara said, "Let the law work. Eli, we do not hide in the ditch anymore." Marshal Grant banged a gavel on the table. "This hearing is convened to examine the validity of the Mercer land claim and allegations of federal fraud," Grant boomed. Sterling's lawyer stood up. "This is preposterous. These are the ravings of a squatter and a woman of ill repute. We have the official survey maps." Clara stood up. She walked to the table and laid the ledger down. "This is the ledger of Silas Mercer," she said. "It details payments made to Sheriff Holloway and Mr. Sterling to suppress the true survey lines." "Forgery," Holloway barked. "The old man could barely write." "And this," Clara said, ignoring him and placing the wooden stake on the table, "is the original corner marker. Dig it up and you will find the surveyor's seal from 1885. The room went silent. The physical evidence was undeniable. Marshal Grant picked up the stake. He looked at Holloway. "Sheriff, care to explain why this stake was found 500 yards from where you said the line was?" Holloway sneered. "Someone moved it." "I did not move it." The voice came from the back of the room. A man stood up. It was Pete, the hired hand Eli had beaten at the cabin, the one whose nose was still bandaged. Pete looked at Sterling, then at the marshal. "I am not going to prison for murder. Sterling, you said it was just a land grab." "Sit down, you fool!" Sterling shouted. "No!" Pete yelled, pointing at Holloway. "The sheriff pushed him. We cornered the old man at the timberline. Holloway told him to sign the paper." Silas spit in his face. Holloway hit him with the butt of his pistol. He fell. He went over the edge. Pandemonium erupted. "Liar!" Holloway roared. He drew his gun. Eli was faster. He didn't draw a gun. He kicked the table over, flipping it toward Holloway to block the shot. Crack! Holloway's bullet buried itself in the wood of the table. Marshal Grant was on his feet, his Colt leveled. "Drop it! Holloway!" Holloway looked at the marshal, then at Eli. He saw the end. He dropped the gun. "Deputies." Grant barked. "Arrest him." The deputies looked at their boss, then at the federal marshal. They were corrupt, but they weren't suicidal. They grabbed Holloway, but in the chaos, Sterling had moved. He didn't go for a gun. He went for the door. He scrambled over a chair and bolted into the street. "He is running," Thorne shouted. Eli vaulted over the overturned table. He hit the street seconds after Sterling. Sterling was running through the slush, slipping and sliding, heading for the livery stable. Eli ran him down. He didn't shout. He just ran, his boots pounding the mud, a predator closing the distance. Sterling reached the alleyway, but the mud was too slick. He turned the corner and ran straight into the overflow of the creek that cut through town. The water was high, swollen with melt. Sterling tried to wade across to the horses on the other side. He slipped. Eli reached the bank. He could have let him go. The current was strong, but Eli waded in. The water was freezing. He grabbed Sterling by the collar of his fine suit and hauled him back. Sterling thrashed, clawing at Eli's face. "I will pay you," Sterling screamed. $10,000. Just let me go." Eli slammed Sterling back against the muddy bank. He held him there, the water rushing around their legs. He raised his fist, ready to crush the man's jaw, ready to extinguish the life of the man who had tormented them. "Eli!" Clara's voice cut through the red haze. She was standing on the bank, the ledger clutched in her hand. "Do not do it. Eli, he is nothing. He is done." Eli looked at Sterling's terrified face. He saw a pathetic, greedy man who had nothing left but money that couldn't save him. Eli lowered his fist. He shoved Sterling toward the bank where Marshal Grant was waiting with handcuffs. "You are not worth the bullet," Eli growled, as the marshal clicked the cuffs on a shivering, weeping Sterling. A shout came from Caleb Thorne. "Smoke! Look at the smoke!" Eli and Clara turned. High up in the valley, a plume of black smoke was rising against the gray sky. "The cabin?" Clara gasped. "Sterling's men," Eli said. "He must have sent them before the hearing. If they burn it, we lose everything." Clara said, "The deed is in the wall safe. They didn't wait for the marshal." Eli grabbed 2 horses from the rail. He swung into the saddle and pulled Clara up behind him. Thorne and 3 of his ranch hands mounted up. "Ride!" Eli shouted. They tore out of town, mud flying. The horses hammered up the trail, lungs burning in the thin air. The smoke was getting thicker, darker. They crested the ridge and looked down into the valley. The cabin was under siege. 3 men were behind the woodpile, firing into the windows. A small fire was licking at the corner of the porch. "They are trying to flush us out," Eli said. "They think we are inside." He pulled his rifle from the scabbard. "Thorne, take the left flank. I will take the right." They charged down the slope. The element of surprise was total. The hired men, focused on the cabin, didn't hear the riders until it was too late. Eli fired from the saddle. 1 man went down, clutching his leg. The other 2 spun around, firing wildly. Bullets zipped through the air. "Clara, get down!" Eli shouted. trying to shield her. "I can shoot!" Clara yelled. She grabbed the pistol from Eli's belt. As they rode past the wood pile, a man popped up, aiming a shotgun at Eli's back. Clara fired. She didn't hit him, but the bullet struck the wood pile inches from his face. He flinched, dropping the shotgun. Eli swung the horse around and leveled his rifle. "Drop it." The men looked at the riders surrounding them. Thorne, his hands, Eli and Clara with a smoking pistol. They threw down their guns. "Get the fire out," Eli roared. They leaped from the horses. They used snow, shovels, and blankets. The fire on the porch had caught the dry logs, but it hadn't reached the roof yet. They shoveled snow frantically, the steam hissing and blinding them. It took 10 minutes, but the flames died. Eli leaned against the scorched wall, chest heaving. He looked at the blackened logs. He looked at the damage. "It is still standing," Clara said, coming up beside him. She was covered in soot, her face streaked with sweat and mud. Eli looked at her. He reached out and wiped a smudge of ash from her cheek. "It is damaged," he said. "It can be fixed," she said. Marshal Grant rode up 20 minutes later with a wagon to collect the prisoners. He surveyed the scene. The bound hired men, the scorched cabin, the exhausted defenders. "You folks have had a busy day," Grant said, tipping his hat. "Is it over?" Clara asked. Grant nodded. "Sterling and Holloway are in irons. The judge is already drawing up the papers to transfer the title officially to Eli Mercer. Your uncle's name is cleared, ma'am, and the claim is yours." He looked at the view of the valley. "It is a good piece of land. Hard, but good." "Thank you, Marshal," Eli said. Grant gathered the prisoners and rode out. Thorne and his men tipped their hats and followed. Silence reclaimed the valley. The sun was setting, breaking through the clouds to cast a golden light on the snow. Eli and Clara stood on the porch. The smell of wet char was heavy in the air. The door was hanging off one hinge. The window was shattered. "It is a mess," Eli said. Clara took his hand. "It is our mess." They walked inside. The cabin was cold, but the wind had died down. Eli turned to her. He looked at her in the dim light. The adrenaline of the chase and the fight was fading, leaving behind a raw, shaking relief. "You saved my life today," Eli said. "At the river. You stopped me from becoming a killer. And you saved mine." Clara said, "You gave me a voice." They didn't say anything else. The distance between them vanished. Eli pulled her to him. And this time, it wasn't tentative. It wasn't careful. It was a collision of relief and need. He kissed her, tasting the smoke and the salt of her skin. Clara wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him down, her fingers tangling in his hair. They sank onto the bedroll in the corner of the room. The cabin was battered. The world outside was harsh, but in here, in the gathering dark, there was warmth. They stripped away the layers of wool and leather, the armor of survival. When skin touched skin, it was vivid and unashamed. It was an affirmation that they were alive, that they had won, and that they belonged to no one but each other. Later, as the moon rose over the peaks, they lay tangled together under the firs. Eli traced the line of Clara's spine with his hand. "We have a lot of work to do," he whispered. "The roof needs patching, the door needs hanging." Clara rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady thump of his heart. "We have time, Eli, we have all the time in the world." She looked at the window, where the moonlight illuminated the jagged peaks. The scars of the day were there, the bruises on Eli's face, the burn marks on the porch. Justice hadn't erased the scars, but it had given them the space to heal. And for the first time since she had arrived in the mountains, Clara closed her eyes and slept without fear, held fast in the arms of the man who had been a stranger, and was now her home. Spring in the high San Juans did not arrive with a gentle greening of the hills. It arrived like a fever breaking. One morning, the silence of the winter was shattered by the sound of dripping water. A relentless, rhythmic drumming from the eaves that sounded like 1,000 fingers tapping on the roof. The snow, which had been a beautiful, deadly blanket for 5 months, turned heavy and gray. It slumped off the pine boughs with wet thuds. The river, locked in ice since November, woke up with a roar that shook the ground, transforming from a silent ribbon into a brown, churning monster that chewed at the banks and carried whole trees downstream like matchsticks. Survival shifted its shape. It was no longer about keeping the heat in. It was about keeping the mud out. The valley floor turned into a soup of clay and slush that sucked the boots off a man and made the horses stumble with every step. Eli and Clara met the season with the same grim determination that had carried them through the blizzard. The cabin, scorched by the fire set by Sterling's men, needed more than just cleaning. It needed healing. "We have to replace the corner logs on the porch," Eli said, inspecting the charred wood. "If the rot gets in there, the whole roof will sag." Clara stood beside him, her boots caked in mud, wearing one of his old flannel shirts tucked into her skirt. "I will mix the chinking mud," she said. "You cut the timber." They worked in a rhythm that had become as natural as breathing. Eli felled 2 straight lodgepole pines from the upper ridge, stripping the bark with his draw knife until the wood shone pale and clean. Clara worked the clay mixture, adding straw and water. Her hands plunged deep into the earth. There was no hesitation in her anymore, no fear of dirt or labor. She was part of this land now. They pried out the blackened logs and set the new ones, the wood groaning as it settled into the notches Silas had cut years ago. When they packed the fresh chinking into the gaps, sealing the house against the wind, it felt like they were bandaging a wound. "We are rebuilding," Clara said, wiping a streak of clay from her forehead. "Not just the cabin," Eli said, looking at her. "Us." It was true. The trial with Sterling and the sheriff had forged them in fire, but the daily life of spring was forging them in something stronger. Routine. They replanted the garden in the patch of earth that thawed first. Clara found Silas's old seed tin, turnips, potatoes, and a packet of wildflower seeds he must have bought on a whim. They put them in the ground with hope, covering them against the night frosts. Trading became the next hurdle. They needed supplies, and the ledger Clara had kept so meticulously showed they had enough pelts to buy what they needed, provided they could get a fair price. Going back to town was not a victory parade. The legal battle was over. Sterling was awaiting trial in Denver, and Holloway had been stripped of his badge. But the town's memory was long, and its tongue was sharp. As they rode down the muddy main street, heads turned. There were no shouts this time, no open insults, but the whispers were there, rustling like dry leaves. "That is her, the one who lived with him all winter. They say she shot a man. They say she'd ruined Sterling." Clara sat tall in the saddle. She heard them, but they no longer stung. She had learned the difference between being judged and being owned. Judgment was just noise. Ownership was chains. And her chains were broken. They tied up at the general store. Henderson was there, looking harried as he tried to balance his own chaotic books. "Mrs. Mercer," Henderson said, nodding respectfully. "Eli." "We have beaver," Eli said, dropping the heavy bundle on the counter. "Prime winter coats. And 3 silver fox." Henderson inspected the furs. He whistled low. "Best I have seen this season. I will give you top dollar." While Eli negotiated the trade for sugar, coffee, and new tools, Clara watched Henderson struggle with a stack of receipts. "You have a rounding error in your grain shipments, Mr. Henderson," Clara said quietly, glancing at the open book on the counter. Henderson looked up, blinking. "Beg pardon?" Clara pointed a gloved finger. "You carried the 4 instead of the 2. You are shorting yourself $3. Henderson looked. He squinted. He pulled a pencil from behind his ear and did the sum. "Well, I will be damned," he muttered. "You are right. I need a new ledger for the cabin," Clara said. "If you give me one on credit, I will straighten out your accounts for the month." Henderson looked at her. He looked at the women whispering outside the window. Then he looked at the clear, intelligent eyes of the woman in front of him. "It is a deal. Mrs. Mercer," he said. It was a small thing, but it was a wedge in the door. Clara sat at the counter for an hour, her handwriting flowing across the pages, bringing order to chaos. By the time they left, Henderson wasn't just a merchant. He was an ally. And when Mrs. Gable walked in and sniffed at Clara's presence, Henderson silenced her with a sharp look. Mrs. Mercer is working. Mrs. Gable, unless you need something, kindly keep the noise down. Clara walked out with her head high. She wasn't just Eli's wife. She was a woman with a skill, and in the West, competence was the only currency that truly mattered. But the nights were harder. The adrenaline of the fight had faded, leaving space for the ghosts to return. Eli struggled with the quiet. He would wake in the middle of the night, chest heaving, his hand grasping for the knife he kept by the bed. In his dreams, he was back in the water with Sterling, his hands around the man's throat, squeezing until the life went out. Or he was back in the logging camp, standing over the body of the man he had killed years ago. The violence he had suppressed for so long had been unleashed to save Clara, and now it prowled the edges of his mind. A wolf refusing to go back into the cage. One night, he woke with a shout, sitting bolt upright. "Eli," Clara whispered. She was there instantly, her hand on his shoulder. He flinched, pulling away. "Do not touch me. It is a dream. Eli, just a dream. It is not a dream," he rasped, swinging his legs out of the bed. "It is what I am. I wanted to kill him. Clara, in the river. I enjoyed the feeling of his fear." He put his head in his hands. "You married a violent man. You traded one monster for another." Clara moved in the dark. She knelt before him, placing her hands on his knees. "No," she said firmly. "A monster hurts the weak to feel strong. You used your strength to protect. That is not the same thing." "It feels the same," Eli whispered. "The rage. It is the same." Clara took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her in the moonlight. "You are a good man, Eli Mercer, but you are not a tame man, and I do not want a tame man. The world is too hard for that. I need a man who can fight, but I also need the man who asks before he touches, the man who builds a garden. You are both." She kissed his forehead. "Do not fear your own blood, Eli. Just master it." He leaned into her touch, the tension slowly draining from his shoulders. He was beginning to believe her. He could be dangerous without being evil. As the ground fully thawed, they knew it was time to finish the business of the past. They had cleared Silas's name in the courts, but they hadn't honored him on the land. They walked up to the timberline on a Sunday morning. The air was crisp, smelling of pine resin and wet earth. They found the spot near the ravine where Silas had fallen, or been pushed. Eli dug a hole. It was hard work, the ground still rocky and stubborn. He set a marker he had carved from a piece of heartwood cedar. It didn't have a long epitaph, just the name, the dates, and one line. He kept his word. Clara stood beside the grave. She held the letter Silas had written to her, the one that had started everything. The paper was worn, soft as fabric from being folded and unfolded 100 times. "Read it," Eli said softly. Clara opened the letter. She read the words aloud to the wind and the mountains. "I cannot offer you passion, but I can offer you safety and my name." She lowered the paper. "He gave me both," Clara said, tears pricking her eyes. "Just not the way he intended. He gave me safety by bringing me here. And he gave me his name to shield me until I was strong enough to make it my own." She looked at Eli. "The promise wasn't a chain," she said. "It was a bridge. It brought me to you." She folded the letter. She didn't bury it. She put it back in her pocket. It wasn't something to be discarded. It was part of the foundation. Returning to the cabin, they found a rider waiting. It was a courier from the stage office, carrying a letter with a St. Louis postmark. Clara took it. Her hand trembled slightly, but only for a second. "It is from Thomas," she said. Eli watched her. "You do not have to open it. I know." She broke the seal. She read it quickly. Her face remained impassive. "What does he say?" Eli asked. "He says the family is willing to overlook my indiscretion if I return and sign over my claim to the inheritance held in trust. He says he has found a widower who is willing to take me on, despite my damaged reputation. He says he forgives me." Eli felt the old rage spark. "I will kill him," Clara laughed. It was a genuine laugh, light and free. "Why? He is irrelevant." She walked to the stove. She opened the iron door and tossed the letter into the flames. She watched the paper curl and blacken, the words of her brother turning into smoke that was sucked up the chimney and dispersed into the vast, indifferent sky. "I do not need his forgiveness," Clara said, dusting her hands. "And I do not need his approval. I have chosen myself." She turned to Eli. "And I have chosen you." That night, the intimacy between them shifted again. It was no longer the desperate, adrenaline-fueled connection of the blizzard or the chase. It was steady. It was fierce, but it was threaded with a profound safety. They lay together in the dark, the fire casting low shadows. Eli's hand rested on her stomach, his thumb tracing the curve of her hip. "We could fill this cabin," he said softly. Clara went still. Children? Silas built the loft for a reason. Clara was silent for a long time. The fear was there, the fear of bringing a child into a hard world, the fear of her own past, the fear of repeating the coldness of her own upbringing. "I am scared," she admitted. "I do not know how to be a mother. My own mother was distant. She let Thomas rule the house. She let me be sold." Eli pulled her closer, his chest against her back. "You are not her," he said. "You are the woman who walked through a storm. You are the woman who faced down a mob. You would be a lioness." "Clara, and you?" she asked. "What about your wolf blood?" Eli kissed her shoulder. "Wolves protect the pack. Clara, they die for the pack. I would teach a son to be gentle. I would teach a daughter to be strong. And I would teach them both that love is a choice, not a trade." Clara turned in his arms. She looked at him, her eyes shining. "Okay," she whispered. "One day. One day." Eli agreed. The final test of their place in the world came in early June. Caleb Thorne was raising a new barn to replace one lost to heavy snow. He sent word up the valley, inviting everyone. It was not just a work party, it was a social event. The whole settlement would be there. "We should go," Clara said. Eli hesitated. He hated crowds. He hated the way people looked at his scars. "They stood by us, Eli, Thorne, Pendergast. We owe them our labor." So they went. The barn raising was a chaotic, joyous affair. Men swarmed over the skeleton of the structure, hammering and shouting. Women set up long tables with food. When Eli and Clara arrived, there was a momentary hush. But then Caleb Thorne walked over, his hand outstretched. "Good to see you. Mercer, we need a man who knows timber on the ridge beam." Eli took the hand. "I can handle it." Clara walked to the tables. Mrs. Gable was there, slicing a ham. She stiffened as Clara approached. "Mrs. Gable," Clara said pleasantly. "That ham looks dry. You should baste it with cider vinegar." "Mrs." Gable blinked. She looked at the ham. She looked at Clara. "Is that so?" She sniffed. "It cuts the salt." Clara said, "My grandmother's trick." "Mrs." Gable hesitated. Then, begrudgingly, she nodded. "There is a jug of cider in the wagon. If you would fetch it." It wasn't an apology, but it was an acceptance. Clara fetched the cider. By noon, she was cutting pies alongside the other women, her laughter mingling with theirs. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't flaunting. She was just there. Eli worked on the high beams. He swung his hammer with a rhythm that drew admiring looks from the younger men. He wasn't the wild mountain man anymore. He was a master craftsman. At sunset, a fiddler climbed onto a wagon bed. The dancing started. Eli came down from the roof, wiping sweat from his neck. He found Clara by the lemonade barrel. "Do you dance?" he asked. "I used to," she said, "in the parlor. But those were waltzes. This looks rowdier." Eli grinned. He took her hand. "Follow me." They stepped into the circle. Eli wasn't a graceful dancer, but he was strong. He spun her around, her skirt flaring out, her hair coming loose from its pins. Clara laughed, throwing her head back, her face flushed with joy. For the first time, the town saw them not as a scandal, but as a couple. They saw the way Eli looked at her, like she was the only light in the world. They saw the way she held on to him, not for support, but for connection. They rode home under a sky bruised with stars, exhaustion settling into their bones, but their spirits light. But the mountains never let you rest for long. 2 weeks later, the late spring melt brought one final trial. A warm rain had been falling for 2 days, destabilizing the high slopes. Eli was down by the river, checking the supports for the new bridge they were building. Clara was in the garden. A sound like thunder rolled down the valley, but there was no lightning. Eli looked up. High above, a section of the sodden hillside gave way. A slurry of mud, rock, and timber came crashing down toward the river. "Eli!" Clara screamed. She ran toward the bank. Eli saw it coming. He scrambled up the bank, but the mud was faster. It clipped him, a heavy pine log slamming into his leg, knocking him into the churning water. The current grabbed him. He grabbed a willow branch, holding on with all his strength, but his leg was useless. Blinding pain shooting up his hip. Clara didn't scream again. She acted. She grabbed the coil of rope from the fence post. She didn't run to him. She ran downstream, to the bend where the water slowed. She tied the rope around a sturdy aspen tree and then around her own waist. She waded into the freezing water. "Let go, Eli!" she shouted. "Let the current bring you!" Eli looked at her. She was waist-deep in the flood, bracing herself against the pull. He let go. The water swept him down. He fought to keep his head up. He saw Clara bracing herself. As he swept past, she lunged. She grabbed his coat collar. The weight hit her hard. The rope went taut, snapping her back against the current. It squeezed the breath out of her, cutting into her waist. But she didn't let go. She dug her boots into the riverbed. She hauled him in, inch by inch, fighting the roaring power of the melt. She dragged him onto the mud, both of them collapsing, gasping for air. Eli rolled onto his back. He looked at his leg. It was twisted, broken. "You got me," he wheezed. "I got you," she said, coughing water. She got him to the cabin. She set the leg herself, using the strength he had taught her, ignoring his groans of pain because it had to be done. She splinted it with cedar shingles. That night, as Eli lay in bed, feverish but safe, he watched Clara move around the cabin. She stoked the fire. She brewed willow bark tea for the pain. She checked the rifle by the door. She was not the frightened girl who had arrived in a blizzard. She was the master of this house. "You saved me," Eli whispered. "Partners," Clara said, bringing him the tea. "That is the deal." Summer finally broke the next week. The valley turned a shocking, vibrant green. Wildflowers exploded in the meadow. Blue columbine, Indian paintbrush, larkspur. The cabin glowed with earned peace. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, no longer fighting the wind. The tools were hung neatly on the porch. Inside, the ledger sat on the table, filled with Clara's neat handwriting, recording not just debts, but a life being built. One evening, Eli sat on the porch, his leg propped up, whittling a piece of pine. Clara sat beside him, mending a shirt. The sun was dipping behind the peaks, painting the sky in violet and gold. Clara looked at the valley. It was theirs. The deed was in the safe. The garden was sprouting. The past was ash in the stove. She thought about the words she had spoken when she first arrived, shivering and desperate. "I was promised to him. Now I am yours." The words echoed in her mind, but the meaning had twisted, changed shape like iron in a forge. She had been promised as property, a debt to be paid, but she had become chosen as a beloved. She had not been taken, she had given. And Eli, he had inherited a cabin, a wooden shell of a dead man's life. But he had built a home. He had taken the walls and filled them with warmth. He had learned that a man didn't have to be alone to be strong. Eli stopped whittling. He looked at her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I was thinking about promises." Clara said. She reached out and took his hand. His palm was rough, scarred, and warm. "I was thinking that the best promises aren't the ones written on paper," she said. "They're the ones we keep every day. The wood chopped, the bread baked, the hand held in the dark." Eli squeezed her fingers. "I am yours." "Clara," he said, "not because of a will, but because I cannot imagine being anyone else's." Clara smiled. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "And I am yours, Eli. By choice, by heart, by right." They sat in the quiet, watching the first stars come out over the mountains. They were two people who had refused to be broken by a hard world. They had found love not in a fairy tale, but in the mud and the snow and the struggle. And they knew, with the certainty of the mountains themselves, that their love was as wild and brave as the land that held them. Thank you for listening to this story. Writing the journey of Eli and Clara has been an adventure into the heart of the American frontier, exploring how resilience and love can bloom in the harshest of winters. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this tale of the Wild West, please subscribe to From Wild West for more stories of survival, romance, and the rugged history of the frontier. Share your thoughts in English in the comments. Did Clara's choice resonate with you? What did you think of Eli's transformation? I look forward to reading your insights. Until the next trail, keep your fires burning.